Chapter 5:17. There is a typo, a big typo, bothering me. A few days ago, a friend reminded me in the book review section. I thank you very much. However, I didn't add to it at the time. Now, I've forgotten your ID. I'm truly sorry. Most importantly, there was a power outage yesterday. Although I had the book, I lost the internet. I was in a rush to go to a classmate's house to update and wrote the chapter names wrong. What bitter tears. It should have been a ridiculous thing. I'm truly sorry. Today, I was looking at the monthly vote rankings. Qingyu is 4th in the old book. Oh, no. Amidst the screams, 5th. 200 fewer votes than the top 3. Shake as hard as you can. Shake as hard as you can to get the votes out of your jars. The Crown Prince and Fan Xian were brothers by blood. There was no irreconcilable hatred between the two. In the end, that was a matter for the elders. The Crown Prince had once expressed his desire to reconcile with Fan Xian, but Fan Xian did not believe him. Most importantly, Fan Xian knew that the Crown Prince did not have enough power or a strong state of mind to bring him down. Thus, the biggest target of Fan Xian's actions during this half a year was the eldest princess. He had not thought that the emperor would only imprison her in the end and rushed to depose the Crown Prince. This reality made Fan Xian ponder for a long time. He always felt that there was a problem with the order. Given the emperor's many years of immersion in the arena, he shouldn't have made such a mistake. Regardless of whether or not there was a mistake in the order, the matter of deposing the heir had, in the end, spread out with a bang in the Qing court. Perhaps using the word bang was not accurate. The wind rises at the end of a duckweed. Any major event in history, at the beginning, was perhaps just some unremarkable wind in the officialdom. A few months ago, the Eastern Palace had caught fire and the Crown Prince had gone to Nanzhao. When the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council threw out some old stories, the Supreme Court suddenly became interested and reinvestigated the matter of the winter coats of the Northern Army. The Ministry of Revenue began to cooperate in researching where the silver had gone. The wind gradually grew. In the spring of last year, in order to attack Fan Xian, the Crown Prince and the Second Prince's factions had investigated the Ministry of Revenue. In the end, the biggest loophole they found was the problem of the winter jackets of the Northern Expedition Army. At the time, the Crown Prince had not thought that this matter would eventually lead to him. Fortunately, His Majesty stopped in the end, and the Crown Prince avoided the fate of losing face. But now that the court had brought up this old matter again, all the officials in the court could smell something different. The Crown Prince no longer had many loyal figures. Who was the emperor going to let the Crown Prince throw out to atone for his crimes? Even at this time, no official thought that the emperor would directly have the Crown Prince take responsibility for this crime. When the Supreme Court and the Overwatch Council took Xian Qiwu into prison, they all thought that this matter was over for now. Who would have thought that Xian Qiwu would be released after only 3 days in prison? Xian Qiwu was a confidant of the Eastern Palace and a close official of the Crown Prince. Because of his good relationship with Fan Xian, he was not tortured in the Overwatch Council and did not betray the Crown Prince. Even so, the Overwatch Council and Supreme Court still bit the Crown Prince and presented the secret memorial to the royal study. In another meeting in the royal study, it was presented to the eyes of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, the ministers of the 6 ministries, and other figures in the center of Qing Kingdom's power. Xu Wu and Hu the scholar pleaded for leniency for the Crown Prince and even acted as a guarantor. Only then did the emperor dispel his feigned anger. After the court was dismissed, when the 2 scholars gathered together to drink again, they couldn't resist sighing and sighing. The emperor was truly determined to depose the heir. As scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, they had to protect the Crown Prince. This had nothing to do with faction. It was just an attitude they had to express as pure officials. As long as the Crown Prince was the heir, they had to treat him like half an emperor. The emperor would not criticize them harshly. Most importantly, the officials in court, represented by Hu and Shu, all thought that the crown prince may have been preposterous and muddle-headed in the past, but he had improved a great deal these 2 years. In order to prevent the court from being shaken by the fight for royal power and in order to prevent Fan Xian, far away in Jiangnan, from participating in these matters, they truly hoped that the emperor would be able to calm his heart and set the Qing kingdom's distant future. No matter how one looked at it, the present crown prince was the best choice for Qing kingdom. It not only prevented internal friction in Qing kingdom, but it also prevented the Overwatch Council, the young man's domination. The Qing emperor was not an incapable ruler. He knew the benefits the checks and balances between ruler and officials brought to Qing kingdom. He also expected that the matter of deposing the heir would certainly cause a great wave of opposition. Thus, he temporarily chose to be silent. It seemed that after the first wave, his thoughts of deposing the heir had been dispelled. However, Hu the scholar and all of the officials knew that their emperor was not someone who made decisions easily. Once he made a choice, no matter what difficulties he faced, he would persevere to the end. As expected, a few days later, the governor of Jiangnan Road, Sir Xueqing's memorial was delivered to the palace. It was read in court. Every word and sentence was directed at the Eastern Palace. Everyone knew the hidden meaning. Shu Wu flew into a rage. Although he knew that this situation could not be reversed, he still stepped out of line and loudly cursed Xueqing for having a disloyal heart and spouting nonsense. The emperor pitied Shu Wu's old and weak body and ordered him to return to his manor to rest for 3 months. He did not punish him at all. The other 6 governors' memorials arrived. Their tones were either heavy or light, overt or covert, but they all subtly expressed their attitudes. The situation was gradually becoming clear. The emperor wanted to depose the heir. The governors of the 7 roads were forced by the emperor's might to submit memorials in response. Only the officials in court were caught in the middle. Even if they wanted to object, they felt the sky above them was covering them and the thorns below them were rising. They felt uncomfortable all over. Although Shu Wu had been invited back to his manor, the Hall of Governmental Affairs continued to perform the righteous role that the Qing emperor allowed them to perform. The courageous officials in court chose their words carefully and expressed their opposition. The timid maintained their silence. Not a single official, under the emperor's hint, courageously submitted a memorial asking the emperor to change the heir. Even the most flattering people would find it difficult to do such a thing. All the civil and military officials in court and the people of Jingdo were watching these officials. The crown prince had not made any major mistakes, yet he was going to be deposed. It was truly inexcusable and would be impossible to explain in the history books in the future. After the court conference adjourned, a few representatives of the civil officials came to the Shu manor and carefully asked for Shu the scholar's opinion. In any case, the emperor knew about these things, so they were not afraid of someone reporting that they had formed a clique. Shu Wu was wearing a cloth robe. After a long silence, he smiled and said, "All things in the world have to pay attention to a reason, particularly the matter of the heir to the throne. It involves the will of heaven and the people. If it does not make sense, then it cannot be served. Fan Xian once said, 'The worries of the world come first and the joys of the world come later.' This is a national matter, not a family matter of the emperor. As an official, I have to help the emperor solve his worries and remove the worries of the Qing kingdom. There is no need to try to figure out the emperor's heart. Just ask your own. The emperor has already made up his mind. What can be done?" Shu Wu stroked the beard on his chin and laughed as he usually did. Sir once said that an official cannot accept the emperor's messy orders. The Sir he spoke of was the master of the manor, Zhuang Mohan, who had passed away 2 years ago. The civil officials split up and went home, each of them silent. In reality, if the emperor wanted to hint to the officials to send in memorials, there were many other ways to easily find the spokespersons in court. Strangely, ever since the storm began, other than the Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian, the emperor had never summoned any official into the palace alone. Thus, the officials were also confused as to whether or not the emperor's mind had not been made up. They were not the governor of the 7 roads, the emperor's servants, so they did not dare to randomly send in memorials. The court sank into an awkward silent confrontation. In the Eastern Palace, the crown prince, who was at the center of the matter, remained warm and quiet. It was as if he did not take this matter to heart. There were no capable people in his faction, yet he had won the support of so many civil officials. This could be said to be an unexpected joy, but it was also an unexpected shock. Thus, while the crown prince was secretly grateful, he grew increasingly silent. In this storm of deposing the heir, there were 2 young people who stood out of the matter and attracted the eyes of the officials the most. The appearances and temperaments of these 2 young nobles were similar. Furthermore, their relationships with the crown prince were complicated. Yet, up until now, their behavior had been unexpected. The first was Fan Xian. In people's eyes, he was a true member of the 3rd prince's faction. Furthermore, he was the emperor's illegitimate child. His identity was too sensitive. Before and after the governor of the 7 roads sent in memorials, he maintained a deathly silence in Jiangnan. His daily invitations to the palace did not mention this matter at all. He only talked in circles about the palace treasury and the daily affairs around it. Although the Overwatch Council had investigated the Eastern Palace from the Ministry of Revenue, it was clear that their investigation was not as strong as the officials had imagined. Everyone could see clearly that the Overwatch Council's actions in Jingdo had nothing to do with Fan Xian. Thus, people suddenly thought of something. Did the emperor throw Fan Xian to Jiangnan also have the intention of cutting him off from the Overwatch Council? Why did Commissioner Fan, who was always gentle on the outside and determined on the inside, not take this opportunity to beat him when he was down? The second was the 2nd prince. Before Fan Xian entered the capital, the 2nd prince had always been deeply favored by the emperor. He was the first of the emperor's sons to be made a king and had a large group of civil officials at his side in court. Later, everyone learned that the eldest princess was protecting the crown prince in the open but was secretly protecting him. This 2nd prince was not simple. He faintly stood up to the crown prince as an equal. The so-called fight for the heir was actually directed at him first. The major events in Jingdo during this half a year seemed to have nothing to do with the 2nd prince. After the eldest princess was placed under house arrest, nothing happened to the 2nd prince. Instead, it was the crown prince who had been exiled by the emperor. Now that the crown prince had been deposed, logically speaking, the 2nd prince should be the one to benefit the most. It was reasonable for him to take action. Even if he wanted to avoid suspicion and gain the emperor's favor by adhering to filial piety and remaining silent, he had actually personally written to defend the crown prince in the Northern Expedition Army winter jacket case and secretly mobilized officials in his faction to stand against the emperor's intentions. Of course, his power in court had basically been shattered by Fan Xian's 2 campaigns. After operating for so many years, he still had some mouths to speak. Most importantly, after he married Yi Ling, it was as if he had become half a master of the Yi family. His words on behalf of the crown prince were indeed useful. The crown prince's 2 brothers, 2 of his greatest enemies, used different methods to express their support during the crown prince's most dangerous time. This was truly a wondrous, wonderful, and mysterious situation. Presumably, the Qing emperor's emotions at this time were very complicated. Before the matter of deposing the heir had reached its climax, a climax had already occurred on one of the 3 most dangerous borders in the world. It shocked the already anxious Qing officials into excitement. The 3 most dangerous borders were the border between northern Qi and the northern Man, the border between the Qing kingdom and Shihu, and the border between the Qing kingdom and northern Qi. In the extreme north, there had been 3 consecutive years of snowstorms. The frozen northern man cattle and horses died. They had no choice but to move around the sky. After tens of thousands of li of bitter battle, they finally circled around from the north of northern Qi to the west of the Qing kingdom. However, they paid the tragic price of 70 to 80% of their entire population. This was a major event in history. For the present world, it had a far-reaching effect. First of all, the northern Qi people no longer had to worry about the tall and barbaric barbarians behind them. They could finally free up a hand to deal with the Qing people in the south. That hand was the famous General Shang Shanhu. After Shihu used 2 years to digest the northern man who came to join them, their strength suddenly increased. Although there were not many northern man survivors, those who could endure tens of thousands of li of travel without food or medicine were all elite young men and women picked out from thousands of li. The Qing kingdom was attacked from both front and back. The pressure increased dramatically. Only then did the Dingzhou Yi family send emergency reinforcements to the western front. King Jing's heir, Li Hongcheng, was playing hide-and-seek with the Hu people in the west. In the north, Yan Xiaoyi had also returned to camp early. He used his powerful military power to suppress Shang Shanhu's strategy and the northern Qi people's bad ideas. The climax of the border this time erupted on the northern front, between the northern governor Yan Xiaoyi and the famous general Shang Shanhu. When Shang Shanhu led the army back and gave Yan Xiaoyi time to think and prepare, Yan Xiaoyi did not even think about his path of retreat in the Qing kingdom or prepare to receive the Qing emperor's arrest. He directly led the army north. With 20,000 elite soldiers, he followed Sangzhou and Yanjing and attacked the northern camp. There was never too much deception in war. The power of the army was like a hurricane. Yan Xiaoyi carried out this principle perfectly. Without asking the Bureau of Military Affairs or waiting for the Qing emperor's edict, he personally led the army and attacked. Shang Shanhu, who had always calculated everything on the battlefield, clearly did not expect that Yan Xiaoyi would still have the mind to send out troops to attack when he could not even protect himself. The northern Qi army was slowly retreating 50 li. Before they could set up camp, they were suddenly attacked in the night and suffered heavy losses. The Qing kingdom army had only paid with 5,000 lives. It was a great victory in Sangzhou. In people's impression, this seemed to be the first time Shang Shanhu had lost a battle. When the news got back to Jingdou, regardless of whether it was Xu the scholar, who had been ordered to rest, or the common people selling alcohol on the streets, they all became excited. The desire to fight and the passion to expand the borders buried deep in the Qing people's blood was stirred to its peak by this shameless, great victory. The black cloud that had been floating above Jingdou did not seem so piercing. Everyone thought that with such great news, the emperor would not continue to persist in his absurdity and do things contrary to people's emotions. It was truly not a good choice. Following the arrival of the battle report was the northern Qi emperor's letter. In the letter, the northern Qi emperor cursed angrily, saying that the two countries were on good terms, yet they were so shameless. After receiving the letter, the Qing emperor only smiled and handed the matter to the office of the Grand Herald and the Board of Rights to handle. In today's world, the boundaries between countries were always so vague. It was always hard to say who entered whose territory. If it was really a misunderstanding, he could apologize in a few days. In any case, the person who was killed could not come back to life. The emperor smiled slightly at eunuch Hong beside him and said, "Yan Xiaoyi is not bad. He knows to use the correct method to explain to me the meaning of his existence. Yes, people who had no meaning of existence should not continue to exist. For example, the Crown Prince." Thus, the Supreme Court continued to interrogate the Winter Jacket case. The Overwatch Council continued to dig up all of the Crown Prince's wrongdoings. The most shameless was the Eighth Bureau. It seemed that they were preparing to write a memoir of the Crown Prince's teasing of serving girls as a child. The matter of deposing the heir did not stop because of Yan Xiaoyi's great victory. It only rested for a while. Under the disappointed gazes of the officials, it slowly and unquestionably proceeded. None of this had anything to do with Fan Xian. He was on a civilian boat, looking at the council report in his hand in a daze. He thought to himself that the emperor was indeed more shameless than him. It looked like in a few days, the worship Xueqing had once mentioned would begin. He wondered what the quiet Qing temple in Jingdo would be like at that time. To find a reason to depose the crown prince and then worship heaven for an edict. The emperor was the son of heaven. Naturally, the crown prince was heaven's grandson. If heaven thought this grandson was not obedient, then heaven's son could only do as he was told. If this was written, it would be much more beautiful in the history books. It was truly shameless to the extreme. Fan Xian shook his head and put down the council report. Ever since Xueqing began to write, he had fled Suzhou. He had not returned to Hangzhou or Wuzhou. He had only disguised himself as a commoner and boarded a civilian boat. Unconsciously, he wanted to get as far away from this political whirlpool as possible. He also knew about the second prince writing to protect the crown prince. He thought to himself that the second prince's heart was truly ruthless. Chapter 5:18. There are still 80 votes from the top 3. Everyone, good luck. I also do my best. It seems to be reaching the climax. I am a bit panicked. Fan Xian was not running. He was running away. In any case, he was walking away from Jiangnan, Jingdo, and the heart of the political storm in the Qing kingdom. He knew that no matter how the situation in Jingdo developed, the emperor had already made up his mind. No one could stop the matter of deposing the heir. Since it was so, any further action he took would be superfluous. Furthermore, he was worried that when the emperor prayed to heaven, he would drag him back to Jingdo and place him in front of him as a human shield. The crown prince had been deposed. There would certainly be a lot of turbulence in the court. No matter how Fan Xian calculated, the emperor would certainly have him carry out a clash with those turbulence and restabilize the balance of the court. During this period of time, his mood had always been low. Just as mentioned earlier, questions concerning life always floated back and forth in his mind. He did not have the energy to pay attention to these things. He knew that at a time like this, the further he ran, the smarter he was. Furthermore, each time he thought of the Qing emperor making such a decision in that beautiful and lonely Qing temple, Fan Xian felt strange and uncomfortable in his heart. That temple was where he and Lin Wanner had first met. It was where he and his wife had pledged their love. Now, it had become a place to fight for power. It was very annoying. Thus, he chose to stay far away. When Yan Xiaoyi led tens of thousands of elite soldiers straight toward the north camp to carry out a night attack, Fan Xian also boarded a large ship on a slightly stuffy night and headed straight from Hangzhou to the sea. He planned to circle around the rising and falling coastline of the Qing kingdom's east and carry out a peaceful journey. This time, he left before the emperor's edict arrived. He also didn't inform Xueqing and carried it out in secret. Fan Xian did not want to participate in this matter again, so he ran with great determination. If the Qing emperor found out that the edict he had summoned for him could not be delivered, he might be angry, but he could not blame him. He was the imperial envoy of Jiangnan Road and needed to sit in the yamen. The only place he needed to sit in the yamen was in the palace treasury. His trip in disguise this time was in the name of inspecting the palace treasury's eastern road. However, his destination was Danzhou. He had two goals in returning to Danzhou. One was to see his grandmother. The housekeeper in the Danzhou manor had sent a letter saying that his grandmother's health had not been well recently. This made him very worried. Secondly, he wanted to ask for her opinion on the complicated situation in the Qing kingdom and the world. Ever since he was a child, he had grown up beside his grandmother in Danzhou and received her teachings. Whenever the tense became chaotic and uncontrollable, he would always unconsciously ask for her guidance. Perhaps his grandmother could not help him much, but at least she could calm his heart. The ship left the harbor and advanced with all its might towards the rising sun in the east. Fan Xian only had time to admire the majestic scenery before returning to the cabin. He sat next to the large chest of silver, tilted his head, and began to count. He was counting the Zhangzhou victory report in the council report. No matter how Fan Xian counted, he did not feel that there was anything wrong with the victory. It was just that the timing of the battle or local battles was a bit strange. He furrowed his brows. These days, he had already begun to make arrangements. Once the situation in the Qin kingdom was settled, how he should handle it, whether or not he should give up the Overwatch Council, and how the emperor would arrange for him. But as he thought about it carefully, he always felt that he was thinking too early. When the cunning rabbit died, even if the dog didn't enter the pot, there wouldn't be much meat to eat. The problem now was that not only was the cunning rabbit not dead, it had also been overly well behaved. Accurately speaking, as long as the eldest princess, Li Yunrui, did not die, Fan Xian did not think this matter would come to a complete end. After a few more days, the matter of deposing the heir in Jingdou should have reached its final stages. Fan Xian was alone on the ocean and did not know the progress of the matter. Because he didn't want to accept an imperial edict, he even had the ship temporarily cut off contact with the Overwatch Council's intelligence system. Like a black, anti-radar aircraft, he floated alone on the ocean. The ship arrived in a small city on Jiangbei Road. The civilian ship he was on was modified from the Overwatch Council's military ship. Normal people would not be able to see anything wrong with it. He had thought that on the way back to Danzhou, he would not attract any attention. Unexpectedly, the officials in that small town respectfully delivered generous gifts, and without requesting to meet them, they withdrew on their own accord. Fan Xian was a bit confused. He wondered how this minor official had guessed he was on the ship. Wang Qinian smiled and said, "You are too imposing." This flattery was too poor, so Fan Xian expressed his dissatisfaction. He turned his gaze to the other man with the surname Wang. 13th Wang glanced at him and shrugged. "Who knows? It seems to me that you're quite happy to receive the gifts." Fan Xian was not happy that he had seen through his vain side. 13th Wang laughed heartily and walked to the side of the ship. Holding the green banner in his hand, it was like a small sail. It appeared very comical. The most important thing in officialdom was to exchange information. The officials in the small city knew that the commissioner of the Overwatch Council was on the ship. Thus, all the officials in the provinces along the coast knew of this news. From that day on, the ship followed the coastline north. Every time it stopped, local officials would come forward to give gifts. They all seemed to guess that Fan Xian did not want to see them, so they did not ask to meet. After traveling and stopping for a dozen days, 14 groups of people came on the ship to give gifts and greetings. Fan Xian sat at the head of the ship and looked at the large piece of green jade that brushed past him. It was the Dong Mountain that had been cut in half by the heavenly sword. He was still lost in thought. How had his movements been completely discovered by others? In any case, he was getting further and further away from Jingdou and the emperor. Fan Xian's mood became more and more relaxed. On the contrary, he was slightly intoxicated by the scenery along the way and the scene of the officials waiting on him like grandsons. In another world within another world, there was once a drunkard named Linghu who had taken a boat on the Yellow River. He had muddle-headedly received countless large gifts, received countless verbal benefits, and suffered physical pain. Presumably, that eldest disciple's vanity had been greatly satisfied. Especially in front of those shameless junior brothers and junior sisters. Fan Xian had taken a boat on the East Sea and also muddle-headedly received countless large gifts. Although no one dared to disturb him, his vanity had been satisfied to a certain extent. Particularly when Jingdo was in the midst of a storm, he was able to float on a boat on the sea. The wind of the great path was swift. This kind of feeling was very pleasing. Even if this kind of pleasure was only temporary. After the boat passed the isolated seaside and the great Dong mountain that pierced the sky like a half-jade sword, it made 2 more turns. When the temple at the top of the mountain could no longer be seen, it was nearing Danzhou harbor. This was the second time Fan Xian had taken this sea route. He did not have the same impact as the first time he had on the strange and majestic Great Dong Mountain. However, he still felt his heart tremble slightly. The large boat anchored in Danzhou harbor. No officials came to welcome them. Fan Xian let out a breath. Taking Gao De and a few other tiger guards and 6th Bureau swordsmen, he arrived at the door of the old Danzhou manor amidst the burning gazes and endless greetings of the Danzhou people. Fan Xian smiled slightly and thought, hadn't he just come back a year ago? Why were these people still so warm and excited? He stretched out his hand and knocked on the familiar wooden door of the old manor. Just as his finger landed on the door, he furrowed his brows. He could clearly feel countless wary gazes focused on him from all around the manor. However, the owners of these gazes clearly knew how to hide their bodies. For a short time, he did not discover exactly where they were. The countless auras, bright and dark, were filled with a suffocating pressure. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and bent his knees slightly. His left hand gripped the trigger of the crossbow in his sleeve. His right hand hung naturally, ready at any moment to grab the slender black dagger in his boot. At his side, Wang Qinyan's expression did not change. He held the Wei Emperor's sword horizontally. The body of the sword was half exposed and glimmered with a cold light. The hilt was where Fan Xian could most easily reach out and pull it out. 13th Wang's gaze was lowered as he held the green banner tightly. The tiger guards, led by Gao De, also sensed the abnormality. Their brows furrowed slightly as their hands gripped the hilts of their long knives. Only the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council reacted slightly slower. They had been scattered around the commissioner the entire time. Suddenly encountering an enemy, they naturally moved their bodies closer to the shops on the side of the street. Using the darkness of the buildings, they were ready at any moment to dive into the darkness and carry out the most direct conflict with the hidden enemies. Fan Xian was a person who was very afraid of death. Although he did not bring many people, they were all the most powerful in the world. In the past, he had the Shadow and Hai Tang as the vanguard. Now, he had 13th Wang as the fierce warrior. Added to himself, the tiger guards, and the swordsmen, with such a powerful defensive power, even if a great grandmaster came, Fan Xian was confident that he could hold out for a few rounds. In other words, he had always been ready to receive the assassination of a great grandmaster. However, outside the old Danzhou manor, Fan Xian felt a sense of pressure from the people hidden around him despite the powerful power around him. Furthermore, this pressure came from one person. This proved that the person who came was not a great grandmaster. Who else in this world could gather so many aces? Fan Xian furrowed his brows and suddenly smiled bitterly. The wooden door of the old Danzhou manor was slowly pulled open. Following a creak, the tense atmosphere immediately disappeared. A familiar face appeared behind the door, but this face should not have appeared in Danzhou. Sir Ren. Fan Xian looked at Taichung Temple official Ren Shao and inside the manor and smiled bitterly. Why are you waiting for me in my home? Ren Shao smiled but did not greet him. Instead, he made a gesture of invitation. Fan Xian paused slightly and turned his head to glance at 13th Wang. 13th Wang smiled and stayed outside the manor with the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian led Wang Qinian, Gao De, and the others toward the old manor. Along the way, they did not find anything strange. However, they could feel that this usually quiet and secluded courtyard was now filled with a sense of tension. No one knew how many aces were hidden behind the trees and behind the walls. Walking to the door of the back courtyard, ran Xiao and stopped his steps. A eunuch welcomed Fan Xian in with a face full of smiles. The smile on Fan Xian's face grew more bitter. He looked at eunuch Yao speechlessly for a long time. Walking to the little building in the back courtyard, a few officials were waiting quietly on the first floor. Seeing Fan Xian enter, they all rose and bowed. Fan Xian returned each of their greetings. He recognized the Minister of the Board of Rites and the Imperial Astronomer. Eunuch Yao walked him to the first floor. Fan Xian picked up the front of his robe and walked with heavy steps toward the second floor. His grandmother lived on the second floor. Lifting the beaded curtain outside the second floor, Fan Xian walked steadily in. Looking at his sickly grandmother on the couch, a glimmer of heartache flashed across his face. Looking at the middle-aged man holding his grandmother's hand and talking by the couch, a glimmer of fear flashed through his heart. He walked to the front of the couch and knelt down obediently. Kowtowing to the two of them, he then forced a smile and said, "Your Majesty, why are you here?" Fan Xian's heart was filled with shock and helplessness. This time, he had left Hangzhou for Danzhou and taken in the sights along the way. He had thought he would be as free and at ease as his eldest disciple brother, waving his sleeves and throwing the matter of dethroning the heir to the back of his mind. He had not thought that his teacher, Yu Buchuan, would be waiting for him here. "Am I not allowed to come?" The emperor looked at Fan Xian with a difficult-to-understand smile on his face. Slowly, he said, "You are an imperial envoy, yet you have come to Danzhou on business. I remember that I only gave you authority over Jiangnan Road. I didn't tell you to manage the matters of Dongshan Road." Fan Xian said with a pained expression, "It was mainly to check on the palace treasury's east road. After passing Jiangbei Road, I thought it was not far from Danzhou, so I came to see grandmother. I heard that she was not well." As her grandson, before he finished speaking, the emperor cut him off angrily. "Filial piety is not something that can be used as an excuse. Run, I want to see where else you can run to." Fan Xian was dumbfounded. He thought, "You want to dethrone the crown prince? I just don't want to participate. There is no need for you to be so angry, right?" However, he had boundless confusion and worry in his heart. He was not stupid enough to argue with the emperor. He smiled and said, "I am an ant in your Majesty's hand. No matter how I run, I cannot escape the palm of your hand." This flattery clearly did not change the emperor's mood. However, the emperor did not seem to want to pursue this matter. Lightly, he said, "Since you have come to show filial piety, then quickly come up and have a look. If you can't cure it, I will carefully skin you." After saying this, the emperor stood and quietly said by the old woman's ear, "Mother, rest well. I will come see you again tonight." Then, he walked out of the room on the second floor, leaving behind a confused Fan Xian. Fan Xian rubbed his legs and stood up. He sat down by his grandmother's side and placed his finger on her pulse. A moment later, his body softened and a streak of cold sweat appeared on his back. The old woman smiled slightly and said, "You monkey, aren't you afraid of scaring me like this? My body is fine. You should be afraid of something else." Fan Xian felt guilty and speechless. He was indeed afraid of something else. The emperor had come to Danzhou without anyone knowing. Wasn't Jingdou an empty palace? At the crucial moment of dethroning the crown prince, why did the emperor dare to leave Jingdou? Chapter 519. I'm in the top 3. Thank you, everyone. Come on, give me some more monthly votes. Thank you, thank you. Fan Xian sat on the bed and gently held his grandmother's hand. He found that the wrinkles on her hand had deepened. There was a palpitating feeling of being separated from flesh and blood. After taking her pulse, he found that his grandmother had only occasionally caught a cold. Her body was fine. However, she was getting on in years. Her oil was about to run out, and her lamp was about to run out. He didn't know how many more years she could endure. Thinking of this, his mood dropped. Adding to the shock brought by the emperor downstairs, it made him sink into silence. After the second floor was silent for a long time, the old woman sighed and said, "Just what are you worried about? I don't know how I'm going to walk my path in the future." Fan Xian looked at his grandmother's serious face and smiled slightly. He knew that under his grandmother's serious face hid a gentle heart. "You've walked well these few years." The old woman's voice was lowered slightly. Although the people downstairs certainly couldn't hear their conversation, she smiled amiably and rubbed Fan Xian's head. She smiled kindly and rubbed Fan Xian's head. Her tone and expression both revealed a sense of pride and relief. Given the position and reputation Fan Xian had obtained these 3 years, the old woman, who had single-handedly taught this grandson, had enough reason to be proud. Half of a 100-li journey is 90 li, Fan Xian patted his head self-mockingly. "I'm just afraid my head will suddenly fall off halfway." The old woman looked calmly at her grandson. A moment later, she gently said, "Did the emperor's arrival in Danzhou make you have some inauspicious thoughts?" Fan Xian lowered his head and thought for a long time. He confirmed what the emotions that had spontaneously risen in him earlier were. He then nodded his head solemnly. The old woman looked into his eyes and quietly said, "You've grown up, but there are some things I must remind you of." "Please speak, grandmother." "The Fan family has never needed to pick a side, and you, even less need to pick a side because we have always stood in front of the emperor," the old woman said solemnly and seriously. The old lady said seriously, "As long as you can guarantee this, then you will never make a mistake." There were countless meanings hidden in these words, but they were all built on the strongest foundation of trust in the emperor. Fan Xian glanced at his grandmother with some confusion but didn't dare to ask. There's no need to doubt what has been proven in the past 30 years. Fan Xian did not think this way. He believed that what history had proven would often be overturned by the future. He thought for a bit and then said, "But, under these circumstances, it is truly too risky for the emperor to leave Jingdou. Are you going to remonstrate later?" The old mistress looked at her grandson with a faint smile. Fan Xian thought for a moment, then nodded. "We should still be able to make it if we rush back now." In reality, these words were just empty words. He knew that since the emperor had come to Danzhou at this time, he must have very important thoughts in his heart. It was not something he could chase away with just a few words. However, as an official, particularly one who had to pretend to be a loyal and filial son, there were some things he had to say in person. The Madame Dowager smiled and said, "Then you should go. Otherwise, His Majesty will be impatient." Fan Xian also smiled but didn't leave immediately. He carefully used the Jinqi of Tianyi Dao to probe into his grandmother's body to check the condition of her body. He left behind a few prescriptions and chatted with her for a while until she began to feel sleepy. Only then did he help her pull up the thin towel and tiptoed down the stairs. Coming down to the first floor, the Minister of the Board of Rites, the Imperial Astronomer, and Eunuch Yao all looked at Fan Xian with strange gazes. These people had not thought that Sir Fan Jr. would be so daring as to stay on the second floor for so long and leave the emperor, who had been waiting to speak with him, hanging for half a day. In this world, Fan Xian was probably the only person who dared to make the Qing emperor wait for so long. These bigwigs were all thinking that His Majesty's love for this illegitimate child had indeed reached a very exaggerated level. Fan Xian bowed to these people and asked with a slight smile, "Where is the emperor?" The Minister of the Board of Rites forced a smile and glanced outside, pointing the way for him. Eunuch Yao suppressed a smile and led Fan Xian out the door. Looking at the osmanthus flowers in the garden. Danzhou was most famous for its scented tea. Minister Fan and Fan Xian both liked it. Every year, the old manor would send it to Jingdo. A portion of it was even offered as a tribute to the palace. Although the garden in the old manor was not large, Fan Xian had partitioned off a corner and planted some osmanthus flowers to mix with tea. Walking to the corner of the garden, eunuch Yao retreated with his body hunched. Fan Xian felt it was strange. The head eunuch of the royal study was not at the emperor's side to serve. Why had he run off? As he thought this, he had already stepped into the garden and saw the emperor under the tree. There was also the old man by the emperor's side. Fan Xian secretly sucked in a breath of cold air. No wonder eunuch Yao didn't have to be by the emperor's side. There was another eunuch at his side. He walked forward and bowed to the emperor. At the same time, he turned his body and said to the eunuch as politely and not abruptly as possible, "Greetings, eunuch Hong." Expressing goodwill to a eunuch in front of the emperor was something that should not have happened, but Fan Xian knew that eunuch Hong was not a normal person. However, Fan Xian knew that eunuch Hong was no ordinary person. Even the emperor would give him some respect. Greeting him should not mean much. Hong Xiang smiled slightly and glanced at Fan Xian. He didn't say anything and retreated behind the emperor. The emperor moved his gaze from the osmanthus tree in the garden and clapped his hands. Turning his head, he said to Fan Xian, "I heard you moved these trees in and planted them?" Fan Xian replied, "Yes, the old manor's garden is not large. Previously, there weren't many trees planted inside. It looked rather boring, particularly in the spring and summer. There are tall trees and bushes of flowers outside, but it is too quiet inside, so I moved a few." "Looks like you have some interest, child," the emperor smiled. The emperor smiled and said, "Back then, when I lived in this courtyard, there were also trees. However, they were all broken by my people who practiced martial arts." Fan Xian was speechless. He had lived in this manor for 16 years, but he had never known that the emperor had once lived here. The old woman's mouth was truly tight shut. He suddenly thought of the past that his father and King Jing had once mentioned. Back then, the emperor had once taken Chen Pingping and his father to Danzhou to play. At that time, the emperor was still an unknown heir. It was in Danzhou that they had met his mother and uncle Wu Zhu. Looking at it this way, when the emperor lived in the old manor, it was also the moment the wheel of history began to turn. As he strolled around the garden and chatted idly with the emperor, Fan Xian's mood gradually became anxious. He didn't know what opportunity he should find to open his mouth and urge the emperor to hurry back to the capital. The expression on his face began to appear unnatural. "I am not in plain clothes." Seeming to guess what Fan Xian was thinking, the emperor said with slight mockery, 3 days after I left Jingdo, I announced it to the world, so don't worry too much." Fan Xian opened his eyes wide and asked in shock, "Your Majesty, everyone knows you have come to Danzhou?" "Wrong, everyone knows I am going to worship heaven." The emperor glanced at him, put his hands behind his back, and walked first out of the garden. Fan Xian glanced at eunuch Hong with some confusion and quickly followed. Following behind the emperor, he asked, "Your Majesty, why did I not know of this matter?" The emperor did not stop walking. Smiling coldly, he said, "Imperial envoy, you were having fun on the sea. How could you have received the edict I sent to Hangzhou?" Fan Xian was greatly embarrassed and didn't reply. The emperor paused and then angrily said, "You are, after all, an imperial envoy. How could you leave your post without permission?" "I have already given the edict for you to meet up with the group worshipping heaven. When you return to Hangzhou in the future, walk through these procedures." After Fan Xian's great embarrassment, he was slightly surprised. The emperor's edict had long been announced to the world for him, an imperial envoy, to join the group worshipping heaven. No wonder the officials along the coast had guessed the people on the ship. However, the emperor's words earlier were clearly to protect him. It looked like after the Jingdo matter had passed a few months ago, the emperor's mood did not seem so bad. Seeing the emperor's footsteps step out of the old manor's wooden door, the guards hidden in the shadows and officials in the courtyard all followed out. For a moment, the scene was incomparably lively. Fan Xian couldn't resist any more and caught up a few steps. Lowering his voice, he said, "Your Majesty, the situation in Jingdo is not yet settled. Since it is time to worship heaven, I will escort your Majesty back to the capital." The emperor stopped his steps and turned his head to glance at him with amusement. "Since it is to worship heaven, why do we have to return to the capital?" Fan Xian replied, "Naturally, it is in the Qing temple." "There is more than one Qing temple," the emperor said lightly. "There is also a temple on Dong Mountain." Fan Xian's heart jumped. For a moment, he couldn't speak. The emperor had traveled thousands of li to Dong Mountain to worship heaven. No wonder there were very few scholars and officials among the servants with him. Instead, it was the minister of the Board of Rites, Taichung Temple, and the imperial astronomer who followed. Worshipping heaven and deposing the air indeed needed these people. Why wasn't this done in Jingdo? Why had it come to the shores of the East Sea? Was the emperor not worried at all? "I know what you are worried about." The emperor's expression was slightly gentle. It was as if he felt that his son was always thinking about his father's safety. His heart was praiseworthy. After thinking for a bit, he smiled slightly and said, "Since you are unable to control your worry, then I will leave my safety in your hands." Fan Xian was surprised again and repeatedly smiled bitterly. He wondered why he had taken on such a difficult task. At this time, he could not refuse and could only give thanks and agree. "In a moment, come see me on the dock." The emperor knew what Fan Xian was going to do next. After saying this, he and eunuch Hong left the manor and climbed into the carriage. Eunuch Yao, along with a group of servants and officials, also followed out. Fan Xian stood at the manor door and looked at the slightly changing light around him on the street. He knew that the Tiger Guards and the Overwatch Council swordsmen accompanying the emperor had already followed. He relaxed slightly. He waved his hand. Wang Qinian ran over from the other side of the street. With a face full of astonishment, he said to Fan Xian, "Sir, the person who went earlier was..." Fan Xian nodded. Wang Qinian swallowed his saliva with great difficulty and said in a low voice, "Why is this master here?" Fan Xian's expression darkened slightly. He muttered, "No one knows why. I only know that if something happens to him, I'm done for." If something happened to the emperor during the process of worshipping heaven, Fan Xian, as the commissioner of the Overwatch Council and now with the heavy responsibility of being a bodyguard, would die a wretched death. At least, the people in Jingdo would certainly put this black pot on Fan Xian's head while they would sit on the chair with a smile. Fan Xian clenched his fist and smiled bitterly in self-mockery. "I don't want to be Sigurjian. Send down an order. Have all of the people in the council stationed in East Shandong Road move out. Be alert. If anyone comes within 50 li of Dong Mountain, send a first-level report." Wang Qinian acknowledged. Fan Xian continued, "Send the order to Jiangbei. Have Jing Gu take 500 black knights and rush through the night to reinforce Dongshan Road. Set up defenses along the northwest line and coordinate with the local provincial army. Make sure there are no problems. If there is any strange movement, kill without mercy." Wang Qinian raised his head and glanced at Fan Xian. The northwest direction of Dongshan Road led directly to Yanjing and Cangzhou. It was where Governor Yan Xiaoyi's camp was. However, the two places were very far apart. If Yan Xiaoyi truly had the courage to rebel and kill the emperor, he would not have been able to move his army so far away without alerting the court. "Being careful is always the best strategy," Fan Xian said with his head down. He was incomparably angry in his heart. Who knew how many people the emperor was going to frighten by doing this? Wang Qinian accepted the order and left. A man in cloth clothing walked to Fan Xian's side and bowed. "By the emperor's edict, please give your orders." Fan Xian glanced at this person and warmly said, "Deputy Commander, you are more familiar with the emperor's personal defense. If there is anything inappropriate, we can discuss it again." The security of the Qing royal palace was handled by the imperial army and the palace guards. The two systems were basically the same. A few years ago, the commander of the palace guards was Yan Xiaoyi. The deputy commander was Gong Dian, who led the imperial army and guards. In the 5th year of the Qing calendar, after Fan Xian's night infiltration of the royal palace, the security arrangements of the royal palace underwent a major change. Yan Xiaoyi was transferred to the position of governor of the north. The imperial army and guards were split into two. Presently, the great prince was in charge of the imperial army while the guards within the palace were under eunuch Yao's control. The person speaking to Fan Xian was the great prince's deputy, the deputy commander of the imperial army. Fan Xian had to be more polite when speaking to him, but he didn't waste time on pleasantries. Straightforwardly, he asked, "How many people from the imperial army have come?" 2,000, the deputy commander of the imperial army replied respectfully. "They are all outside Danzhou to receive orders." Fan Xian nodded. He thought to himself that with 2,000 imperial soldiers, in addition to the numerous aces at the emperor's side, the problem of safety should be guaranteed. He turned his head to glance at the two-story building faintly visible in the corner of the old manor and was slightly lost in thought. He remembered the first time he left Danzhou, his grandmother had once told him to harden his heart. At the same time, she had once said that his mother had died an unnatural death because she was too gentle. In that instant, Fan Xian thought of the words his grandmother had said to him as she held him and the faint truths. Suddenly, his heart jumped. However, he immediately suppressed it and shook his head with a sigh. Eunuch Hong was unfathomable by the emperor's side. Uncle Wu Zhu was not by his side. The Shadow and Hai Tang were also not here. Even with 13th Wang, their power was not strong enough. Furthermore, he was far away in Danzhou and had no way of controlling the movements in Jingdou. Most importantly, Fan Xian had to admit that up until now, the emperor had treated him fairly well. He laughed self-deprecatingly, trying to banish the thought from his mind. The deputy commander of the imperial army did not know that he was thinking of treasonous things. He thought that Sir Fan Jr. was worried about the emperor's safety, so he had to say a few words of advice and pat his chest to express his confidence. On the Danzhou dock, the common people watching had long been chased out of sight. The fishing boats coming and going had long returned to their respective ports. The entire city seemed to have become incomparably oppressive and respectful because of the arrival of the middle-aged man in a light yellow robe on the dock. Only the floating clouds in the sky, the foam in the sea, and the seagulls flying between the sky and water did not seem to feel this kind of pressure. They continued to float and fly freely. The birds searched for food on the sea and gave out sharp cries, startling the emperor who was deep in thought on the dock. He beckoned his hand behind him and said, "Come to my side." Fan Xian, who had been watching the emperor's figure from below the wooden dock, heard these words and jumped onto the wooden plank. He walked to the emperor's side and slightly behind him. Facing forward, he looked at the boundless ocean. "Take another step forward." The emperor held his hands behind his back and did not turn his head. Fan Xian followed the order and took another step forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with the emperor. The sea breeze blew the hair by the side of the emperor's face back. There was no sense of gentleness. On the contrary, it gave off a sense of determination that made one's heart tremble. Below his feet, the waves were beating against the rocks under the wooden plank, turning into one snowflake, two snowflakes, and countless snowflakes. "Stick out your chest." The emperor's eyes looked at the end of the ocean and said to Fan Xian beside him, I don't like you pretending to be a coward. Fan Xian smiled slightly. He understood the emperor's current state of mind. He followed the words and relaxed. Standing shoulder to shoulder with him, he did not open his mouth to speak. The last time I came to Danzhou, I wasn't even the crown prince, the emperor slowly said. The emperor slowly said, that day, Chen Pingping was like Hong Xiang standing behind me. Your father. Fan Jian was like you now, standing side by side with me, bathing in the exceptionally clear sea breeze of Danzhou. Ever since I became the crown prince, Fan Jian never dared to stand shoulder to shoulder with me again. Fan Xian tilted his head slightly and saw a glimmer of self-mockery flash across the corner of the emperor's lips. The emperor said with slight mockery, after I sit on that chair and fight in the north and south, there won't be anyone who dares to stand up straight and talk to me, much less stand up. Fan Xian sighed at just the right time. That day, the three of us came to Danzhou to relax. At that time, Jingdou was in chaos. The two princes were secretly fighting for the throne. The previous emperor was only the unremarkable King Cheng, the emperor said indifferently. As juniors, we had no way of interfering. We could only hide as far away as possible from the place of trouble. He tilted his head and glanced at Fan Xian. In reality, my thoughts are similar to yours. However, you are much more powerful than I was in the past. Fan Xian smiled slightly and said, most importantly, the heart is not strong enough. There are some things that one does not know how to face. Who would have thought that you would have some pity for Cheng Qian? The emperor turned his head and coldly said, however, this is good. Back then, the three of us stood on this dock and looked at the ocean. There was no pity in our hearts for anyone. We only thought about how to protect ourselves and how to survive. I often think that when I looked at the ocean that day, perhaps I was hoping that an immortal would suddenly appear on the ocean. Fan Xian was silent. He knew what the emperor would say next. There was nothing on the ocean, just like today, the emperor said slowly. A glimmer of a smile once again rose to the corners of his lips. However, when we turned our heads, we found that there was another woman on the dock, as well as her strange servant. Fan Xian slowly said with yearning, actually, I have always wondered how you met my mother back then. The emperor's body shook slightly. He was slightly shaken by Fan Xian's sudden "I." Only then did he realize that this kid had unconsciously said it. Involuntarily, the glimmer of a gratified smile appeared at the corners of his lips. However, he did not continue this topic. He only said, I told you earlier, no one has ever dared to stand shoulder to shoulder with me. Only your mother dared. Regardless of whether she was the crown prince or the emperor, your mother dared to stand shoulder to shoulder with me. She looked at the ocean and felt the sea breeze. She did not treat me as someone special at all. Sometimes, she would even look down on me without holding back. The emperor smiled self-mockingly and said, after she died, there was no longer such a person in this world. I don't expect you to inherit much of what she did. I just feel that you shouldn't be too cowardly and damage my and your mother's prestige for no reason. Fan Xian smiled bitterly and thought, this is because you are looking after the past and the present, which is why you allowed me to stand for a while. As for prestige, forget it. My life is more important. Your Majesty, let's return to the capital. Fan Xian finally said what he wanted to say. With a slightly worried expression, he said, leaving the capital for too long is always, seeing that he wanted to say something but then stopped, the emperor coldly said, say everything you want to say. You just want to say that you're afraid that someone will take advantage of my absence to have ill intentions. Chapter 520. Last night, the heaviest rainstorm the city has seen in 10 years hit. It looks spectacular, but I hope it won't be affected. Today, this chapter is easy but important. The next volume will invite everyone to come back and read this chapter. P.S. today is the day of the college entrance examination. I wish the children participating in the exam all the best. Birds chirped by the seaside, the water splashed gently under the pier, and the waves at the bottom of the cliff in the distance made loud noises. Fan Xian stood on the wooden board and was not confused by the emperor's hot-blooded words. Seriously, he said, as the ruler of 10,000 years, he will not enter an unpredictable place. I ask that you return to the capital. The capital is guarded by the Empress Dowager, Chen Pingping, and the 2 scholars. Who dares to make a move? The emperor gazed at the ocean and impatiently waved his hand. If they want to take over the world, they have to take over that chair. First, they have to kill me, who is sitting on the chair. If they can't kill me, let them do as they please. Trash rebelling won't succeed in 10 years. Fan Xian was silent and speechless. He thought to himself that this emperor was truly a strange person. His incomparably powerful self-confidence and intense paranoia mixed together created this person's extremely narcissistic personality. The emperor wanted to draw the snake out of its hole. Perhaps one day he would die from his narcissism. The problem was that Fan Xian did not want to be buried with him. Anji, you have to know that it's very difficult to see through a person's heart. The emperor suddenly sighed emotionally. No one knew if he was talking about his son or his sister. After this rare sigh, a layer of tiredness suddenly covered his expression. The wrinkles on his brows were filled with an indescribable tiredness. This tiredness was not the kind of tiredness he deliberately put on for his officials to see when he sat on the dragon throne in the royal court. It was true tiredness, a kind of weariness that arose from the depths of his heart. Fan Xian stood to the side and calmly studied the emperor's expression. Countless thoughts flashed through his mind. This was the first time he had seen such a real and intimate expression on the emperor's face. However, this true display of emotion was like the clouds above the Danzhou seaport. It only occasionally bloomed and blocked the blinding sunlight. It immediately drifted away and transformed into the porcelain blue sky. After a moment, there was no longer any trace of it on the emperor's face. What was left was only the radiant confidence and perseverance. Occasionally revealing his mortal heart, that person immediately returned to the role of a king. Looking at this scene, Fan Xian could not help but feel a little emotional. He sighed and said, "It is said that it is difficult to draw the bones of a tiger when drawing a person. One may know a person for a long time, but one does not know their heart. Usually, they are gentle to each other, but who knows if there will be a day when they will take 2 straight knives and stab each other in the chest." It was clear that the emperor did not care who Fan Xian was sighing at. He was just thinking about the past while surrounded by these emotions. He stared blankly at the sea and said, "The world may think that I am a heartless person, but they are all wrong." Fan Xian quietly watched the emperor from the side and did not reply. The emperor slowly said, "I have given them too many chances, hoping that they would suddenly repent. Even now, I am still giving them chances. If it were not for love, why would I need to rush about like this?" Fan Xian thought to himself, seducing and forcing people to make mistakes to test their hearts. Looking closely at the crown prince and second princes suffering these years, was the emperor's actions like this out of love or out of his mind? Just like your mother. The emperor's eyes narrowed slightly as if he felt that the sun floating through the clouds was too piercing. Fan Xian's heart tightened slightly as he carefully listened to every word the emperor said. The emperor glanced at him and then turned his face away. Faintly, he said, "She has done a great service to the Qin kingdom. For me, it can be said that my kindness is greater than the heavens." However, with a sudden change, she and her Yi family became a thing of the past and suffered a tragic death. Yet, I remained hidden and did not do anything. Although I later made up for it a little, compared to her kindness, I did very little. Fan Xian understood what he meant. After his mother passed away, the emperor had endured for 4 years before he caught all the nobles in Jingdo involved in the matter in one fell swoop. However, he had left a few important people unkilled. If this was revenge was not complete. The emperor faintly said, "I did not say it," and the two of them did not ask. "However, I know that they are all dissatisfied in their hearts and have resentment toward me." A glimmer of self-mockery suddenly rose to the corners of his lips. "But, what could I do in this matter?" Without saying a word, taking the Yi family into the national treasury and accusing the Yi family of treason was heartless. But, if I were to reverse the verdict for the Yi family, what would the Empress Dowager do? Or, do I have to depose and kill the Empress in order to be truly loyal? Strangely, even as the Emperor spoke to this point, his tone remained calm without a trace of agitation. It made Fan Xian, who was listening to the side, admire him greatly. Of course, he knew that the so-called "they" with resentment referred to his father, Fan Jian, and director Chen Pingping. As an emperor, it is impossible to wander the 4 seas without any hindrances. The emperor calmly said, "If I really did that, I would also be a heartless person. Furthermore, what would the entire court become? I think that if she was alive, she would certainly approve of my actions. She wanted a powerful and prosperous Qing kingdom, and I did it." A determined expression rose to the emperor's face. Looking around, the Qing kingdom is the most powerful country in the world. The people of the Qing kingdom live happier than any other year in history. I think this is enough to comfort her. Fan Xian was silent. In the years after his rebirth, he often asked himself what kind of country the Qing kingdom was and what kind of person the emperor was. Although he had a deeper understanding of all of this after entering the capital and finally touched the emperor's self-confidence, narcissism, arrogance, and masochism, he had to admit one thing. Even with the flood the year before and the snowstorm this year, the efficiency of the Qing kingdom's bureaucracy, the wealth of the people, and the clarity of politics were many times better than the history books he had read in his previous life. In other words, the Qing kingdom was, without question, a peaceful and prosperous world. The emperor by his side was, without question, a wise ruler, even a saint, if the emperor's goal was to let the people eat their fill. She said that the officials of the court needed supervision. When I was still the crown prince, I advised father to establish the Overwatch Council. She said that eunuchs were pitiful and hateful, so I strictly adhered to the rules since the founding of the country and strictly prohibited eunuchs from interfering in politics. At the same time, I ordered the internal court and Taichung Temple to determine the number of eunuchs and do their best to reduce the number of abnormal people in the palace. Fan Xian nodded repeatedly. The number of eunuchs in the Qing royal palace was much less than in northern Qi. This was, without question, a virtuous policy. She said that a wise ruler should be able to listen to advice. All right, I granted the imperial censorate the right to discuss matters. The emperor spoke faster and faster and became more and more lost in thought. Fan Xian couldn't help but bite the tender flesh in his lip, reminding himself not to laugh at the thought of the imperial censorate's buttocks being flogged into streaky meat. She said that there was a need for reform and a need for a root cause. All right, I did as she said. I changed the yuan, changed the system, and carried out new policies. Fan Xian finally couldn't resist smiling bitterly. The yuan was changed in the first year of the Qing calendar. At that time, the change was actually the third new policy. The Ministry of War changed to the Ministry of Military Affairs and then changed to the Bureau of Military Affairs. The Imperial College separated into the Tunguen Pavilion. Later, it was changed to the Ministry of Education and then changed back. Even the names of the 6 ministries from ancient times until now were almost changed by this emperor. The Qing emperor's achievements throughout his life were brilliant and dazzling. However, the 3 new policies in a row were absurd things that he could not avoid in his life. Even now, when the people of Jingdo talked about these yamens, they were still confused. Each time they wanted to go somewhere, they often had to report a number of names. If it weren't for the powerful deterrence of the imperial power and the valiant execution of the Qing officials, which turned the court back to its original appearance and left only those discordant names, the Qing kingdom would probably have long fallen into chaos. The emperor looked at his expression and smiled self-mockingly. You don't have to hide it. I know that this was one of the rare times in my life that I was muddle-headed. However, at that time, your mother was no longer here. I only knew the gist of it. It was hard to avoid making some mistakes. Fan Xian's heart jumped slightly. He thought to himself that after his mother died, the emperor still did as he was told. In terms of this intention, it had to be said that the emperor could be considered a sentimental person in this matter. Before your mother passed, I heard a lot from her. Later, I was unable to do anything for her, the emperor closed his eyes and faintly said. After she passed, I remembered all the things she once mentioned to me and wanted to help her realize them. It could be considered some kind of promise or guilt toward her. Fan Xian sighed and said, if my mother was still alive, she would certainly be endlessly grateful for your majesty's kindness. No, it is not kindness, the emperor opened his eyes and calmly said. The emperor opened his eyes and calmly said, it is only affection. As for admiration, that is even more impossible. I only want to do some things to honor her spirit in heaven. I do not wish for anything else. The emperor suddenly smiled and said, back then, she used a regretful tone to speak of the newspaper. She said there was no gossip to read or interesting news to read. So, I had the internal court make a newspaper and draw some flowers on it. Now that I think about it, I was also very mischievous. Fan Xian was dumbfounded. The internal court newspaper was known as the most useless thing in the Qing kingdom. It was personally written by the scholar and great calligrapher, Sir Pan Ling, and sent to various provinces and counties. It was only kept by the yamen and nobles. If it was on the market, a page of the internal court newspaper would often sell for a great deal of silver. When he was in Danzhou, he had once stolen the newspaper from the old manor to exchange for silver to spend, so he was very familiar with the newspaper. At that time, he had been very disdainful of the gossip content in the so-called newspaper and was very confused about the flowers drawn on the sides of the newspaper. The answer to all of this was, back then, his mother wanted to read gossipy newspapers and listen to interesting news. Fan Xian looked at the emperor with a strange expression and forcefully suppressed the words he was about to blurt out. He had wanted to remind the emperor that the so-called interesting news did not refer to drawing a few flowers on the sides of the newspaper. The emperor did not notice his expression. He spoke more and more happily. Your mother was most curious about Pingping's story. In the 4th year of the Qing calendar, I took advantage of that old dog's visit to his hometown to have the internal court newspaper write about it. If your mother could see it, presumably, she would be very happy. Fan Xian laughed loudly. He also remembered this story. In the spring of the 4th year of the Qing calendar, he had traveled from Danzhou to Jingdou. At the time, the two biggest things in Jingdou were the exposure of Prime Minister Lin Ruofu's illegitimate daughter and the marriage alliance with the Fan family. The second was that the internal courts were not afraid of the power of the Overwatch Council and greatly exposed the youthful story of the director of the Overwatch Council, Chen Pingping. The sun gradually rose by the seaside. It moved from in front of him to behind him, casting the emperor and Fan Xian's shadows on the occasionally rising and falling surface of the sea. The sea water also joined in, making the waves clear and gradually calming. It made the blurry shadows of the two people become clearer and clearer. Fan Xian smiled and lowered his head. He thought, in the end, the emperor was a mortal. Just as he could not forget the Qing temple, the emperor could not forget Danzhou. Probably in this life, only on the Danzhou dock would the emperor say so many things. It was precisely this conversation that was not between ruler and official that made Fan Xian have a slightly more favorable impression of the emperor and a deeper understanding of him. At the same time, it also added more worries. He sighed and turned his gaze toward the sea. The worries in his heart were, in the end, a matter for the future. The worries in front of him were already terrifying enough. What are you worried about? The emperor's mood was relatively relaxed and he casually asked. Fan Xian thought for a moment and then said, the admiral of the Jiaozhou Navy is a disciple of the Qin family. No one knew how large a guard of honor was needed for the emperor to officially go on an inspection tour. Even though the Qing emperor was known for his plain clothes, the court had put a great deal of effort into defense. On land, the provincial soldiers were outside, the imperial army was inside, and there was a group of aces and that strange old creature, Eunuch Hong. It could be called a steel fortress. On the water, a few warships of the Jiaozhou Navy had also received an edict and arrived. They were responsible for guarding against dangers from the sea. As Fan Xian said these words, his eyes were slightly narrowed as he stared at the surface of the sea, at the ships the Jiaozhou Navy had sent to protect the emperor. The emperor's expression was calm. It was as if he did not take Fan Xian's reminder to heart. He said, "There will come a day when I will seek justice for you for the matter of the valley. However, General Qin is the cornerstone of the country, so there is no need to doubt him. Since you have already moved the Black Knights over, there is no need to worry about an attack within 100 li. Why do you have to be restless all day like a stray dog?" Chapter 521. I wish everyone a happy Dragon Boat Festival. Eat more rice dumplings, don't be rice dumplings. There will be a new ticket on Monday, but I still haven't figured out how to do it. Everyone play for a while. I'll watch for a while. The next day, the group left Danzhou at the first glimmer of dawn. Since it was the emperor's entourage, the formation was naturally not ordinary. Although all kinds of ceremonial guards had yet to come out, there was a procession of nearly 3 miles in front and behind. The densely packed crowd surrounded the large carriage in the middle that was full of noble air. It looked astonishing. The people of Danzhou knelt on the ground and respectfully kowtowed to the departing emperor. Perhaps this was their first and only chance to see the emperor in this life. As a citizen of the Qin kingdom, no one wanted to miss it. Fan Xian rode at the back of the group. With a worried expression, he looked at the group walking on the road in the distance. He was about to follow the emperor to the great Dong Mountain Temple to worship heaven. His heart was filled with unease and confusion. Last night, he had met privately with Ren Xiaofan. Only then did he know that the emperor had chosen Dong Mountain to worship heaven not only because the emperor had begun to miss the air of freedom, their past meeting, and Danzhou's sea breeze. Rather, it was because the original plan to worship heaven in the Qin temple in Jingdou had run into difficulties. What difficulties? No one in the Qin temple in Jingdou had the right to host such a large worship ceremony. This was truly a ridiculous reason. The Qin kingdom had always believed in swords and weapons. Although they respected ghosts and gods, they kept their distance. Particularly under the emperor's influence, the power of the ascetic monks in the temple grew weaker by the day. The orthodox Tianyi Dao, led by northern Qi Ku He, was unable to enter the Qin kingdom's temple system. Meanwhile, the few remaining high priests of virtue and prestige had met with problems one after another in the past few years. First, after the great priest returned to the capital from the southern wastelands, he died of old age and illness in less than a month. The second priest, Great Master Sanshi, died tragically in the woods on the outskirts of Jingdou. Fan Xian could faintly guess that the death of the great priest in the Qin temple had been secretly done by the emperor. However, if they wanted to worship heaven, they could actually go to Dong Mountain. After all, it was known as the place in the world most similar to the temple. It was the most mysterious place and the place with the most incense. But, was it only because of such an absurd reason? Fan Xian squeezed his horse's belly and followed the group with a frown. His Majesty's protection work was carried out in an orderly manner, so he did not need to worry too much. Especially when he saw the hundreds of tiger guards with long sabers sandwiched in the imperial army, he felt even more reassured. 7 tiger guards could rival Haitang Duo. What kind of concept was 100 tiger guards? He should be at ease, but he was still worried. In many people's minds, Fan Xian was probably an expert at scheming. He knew that his scheming could not be considered very powerful. In the past, he had been able to win every battle in the Qin kingdom and northern Qi because he had Yan Bingyun's help and Chen Pingping's care. Most importantly, his biggest backer was the emperor. With him as a backer, he could break through any mountain he came across. He had nothing to be truly afraid of. But if the target of a conspiracy was his backer, Fan Xian knew that he did not have enough intelligence to deal with such a big scene. He saw himself very clearly, so he was particularly careful and sensitive. Thinking of the question that had been lingering in his heart since yesterday, he felt a sliver of caution. The emperor going out on patrol was a major event. Even if he had been floating on the sea at the time and cut off his intelligence network with the Overwatch Council, Yan Bingyun, who was in charge of Jingdo Council affairs, would certainly have a way to notify him. The internal communications of the Qinian unit had always been open. Why didn't Yan Bingyun notify him ahead of time? He summoned Wang Qinian and asked a few questions. When he received a report from the council that everything was as usual, he couldn't help but scratch his head. He didn't say anything more and smiled self-mockingly. He felt that he was too suspicious and a bit morbid. Traveling by land, it only took a few days before he saw the lonely mountain by the sea that had blocked the sea breeze for tens of thousands of years and the sunrise in the east. It stood alone and stubbornly pierced into the sky like half a piece of jade. Fan Xian rode beside the emperor's carriage and unconsciously put up a shade. Narrowing his eyes, he looked at the large mountain and sighed in admiration. This was the 3rd time he had seen the great Dong Mountain by the sea. Each time he saw it, he couldn't help but sigh at the wonders of nature. How could such a magnificent sight not open one's mind? After sighing, Fan Xian also felt some pity and anger. He had lived in Danzhou for 16 years, yet he had no idea that there was such a holy land not far from his hometown. Otherwise, he would certainly have dragged Uncle Wu Zhu here often to play. Although the court had sealed off the excavation of jade on Dong Mountain, it did not prohibit the common people from entering the temple to pray. If Fan Xian had often come to play, presumably no one would have stopped him. However, if he was still a child, it would not be so easy for him to enter Dong Mountain today. Flags fluttered at the foot of the mountain. Thousands of people stood in line and completely sealed off the path into the mountain. 3 days ago, the imperial edict had already been sent to Dong Mountain. The priests and monks of the temple on the mountain were respectfully waiting for the emperor's arrival at the mountain gate. The common people who had come up to burn incense had long been chased down the mountain by the local provincial soldiers. On this lonely mountain, thousands of people were silent. An oppressive and strict atmosphere enveloped the surroundings. All of this was for one person, the foremost person in the world. Eunuch Yao stepped onto the wooden frame and helped the emperor, dressed in formal clothing and bright yellow, out of the carriage. The emperor stood on the platform in front of the carriage. Without anyone's command, the thousands of people at the foot of the mountain knelt down in unison and shouted, "Long live the emperor!" The emperor waved his hand with a calm expression, indicating for everyone to rise. After being helped out of the carriage by Eunuch Yao, he naturally left the eunuch's hand. With his hands behind his back, he walked toward the newly repaired mountain gate, which glowed with white jade. Eunuch Hong followed behind the emperor. Fan Xian took a few more steps back and calmly observed the situation. Walking to the foot of the mountain gate, the priests wearing robes bowed respectfully to the emperor again. They then bent their bodies in a fawning manner and invited the emperor to ascend to listen to the heavenly edict. Fan Xian watched this scene and laughed to himself in his heart. The monks of the Qing kingdom indeed did not have as much status as those in northern Qi. The emperor did not immediately move. Looking at the magnificent mountain gate, he smiled warmly and said, "The first edict came a month ago. The exact time of my arrival was set 3 days ago." The temple's reaction was fast. "However, don't disturb the people too much. If a mountain gate is so magnificent, be careful that Dongshan Road doesn't have any silver." The priest's expressions became awkward. The head priest of Dongshan Temple explained in a trembling voice, "Your Majesty, it is only a mountain gate. The temple on the peak is the same as it was 20 years ago. It has not changed at all." The emperor smiled slightly and said, "That is good." Governor He Yongji, who had rushed over to the side to wait on the emperor, wiped the sweat from his forehead. He thought to himself that his flattery had backfired. Fortunately, the emperor's latter words had been gentle. The emperor glanced at the governor and furrowed his brows. "Didn't I tell you not to come in the letter I sent you?" Governor He Yongji was one of the governors of the 7 roads. Although his position was slightly lower than Xue Qing's, he could still be considered a first-rank official. In front of the emperor, he did not have any of the air of a major figure. He smiled bitterly and said, "It is rare for your Majesty to leave the capital, and you have come to Dongshan Road. I and the officials of the roads feel honored. How could I not come to wait on you?" It was clear that the governors of the 7 roads were the Qing emperor's most trusted officials. The emperor smiled and scolded, "Get back to your Luozhou. The governor leads an army. Just do your job well. When have I ever lacked people to wait on me?" He glanced at Fan Xian behind him and said, with Commissioner Fan following, "You can go back." He Yongji did not dare to object. He knew that although the emperor appeared warm, he never went back on his word. He did not tarry. He knelt down again and kowtowed. He nodded at Fan Xian as a greeting and then hurriedly led his people back to Luozhou, where the governor's manor was. Fan Xian watched with a slight smile and did not say a word. The Great Dong Mountain was very tall. Using Fan Xian's measurements, it was at least 2,000 meters. Around the mountain, other than the sea, there were plains. The contrast made the mountain appear even more abrupt and towering into the sky. If one wanted to climb it, no one would not feel a chill in their hearts. Fortunately, the side of Dong Mountain facing the sea was an incomparably smooth jade wall. The side facing the land was the accumulation of millions of years of life from the soil. On both sides of the stone steps, green grass grew. Tall trees rose into the sky. Their branches and leaves were like little green fans that blocked out the first rays of the summer sun. They danced gently in the mountain wind like countless little fans, bringing a trace of coolness to the people walking on it. Perhaps it was such a quiet and beautiful scenery that gave the common people who came up the mountain to burn incense the courage to walk the seemingly endless stone steps. Thousands of imperial soldiers stood guard at the foot of Dong Mountain. Following the emperor to Dong Mountain to worship heaven were old eunuch Hong, Fan Xian, the minister of the Board of Rites, and a group of officials. There were also a number of eunuchs accompanying him. Over 100 tiger guards were also vigilantly scattered around the emperor. However, they did not walk the stone steps. Instead, they walked the small mountain paths, which were a bit more difficult. The tens of thousands of stone steps truly tested one's willpower and energy. The common people called these long stone steps the stairway to heaven. Only by climbing it could one appear sincere and use the miraculous effects of the temple in Dong Mountain to cure illnesses. However, this trip was not for the common people to pray to God. The tiger guards walking between the stones could still hold on. Even the eunuch seemed to have energy to spare. However, the minister of the Board of Rites, Ren Xiaofan, and the other civil officials could not hold on much longer. They couldn't care less about losing face in front of the emperor. Each of them held their waists and panted. Fan Xian had climbed mountains and jumped cliffs since he was a child. These tens of thousands of stone steps were nothing to him. He didn't even pant. He watched these people and found that the eunuchs beside the emperor were able to move so easily. He couldn't help but be speechless. Eunuch Hong was a strange creature. He knew that Eunuch Yao knew martial arts, but even the eunuchs serving tea were skilled. He couldn't help but feel that there were indeed crouching tigers and hidden dragons at the emperor's side. After an indeterminable amount of time, the group of people finally reached the summit. Including a few priests and civil officials, they all collapsed weakly to the ground and couldn't come to their senses for a moment. The emperor glanced at these people mockingly but couldn't be bothered to scold them. Alone, with his sleeves behind his back, he walked to the edge of the cliff at the summit of Dong Mountain. Looking at the floating clouds in front of the cliff and the sun diagonally above, his expression was incomparably calm and joyous. It was as if he had finally achieved, or was about to achieve, a goal. Fan Xian followed behind him and smiled slightly. He saw the emperor's chest rise and fall slightly. His face was slightly red and moist with sweat. It seemed that although the emperor's body was strong, he was no longer the young man who rode into battle. It was only for the sake of the emperor's face that he forcefully endured it. After resting for a moment, the people accompanying them began to arrange the ceremony and the troublesome food and lodging arrangements. The emperor and Fan Xian were still standing at the edge of the cliff. The father and son seemed to be attracted by the wondrous scene at the foot of Dong Mountain. They didn't say a word and only stared in a daze in front of them. In front of them was the ocean, a boundless ocean. However, the ocean they saw from here was different from the ocean they saw from the Danzhou dock. The ocean in Danzhou was close yet not easy to get close to. Rising and falling, it was close to their feet. The sound was by their ears, and white foam soaked the bottom of their pants. The ocean at the foot of Dong Mountain was distant and cold. Standing at the edge of the cliff, it was impossible to hear the roar of the waves. Gazing along the jade-like mountain walls, one could only see white lines advancing wave after wave on the ocean, crashing against the stone walls of Dong Mountain and soaking the foot of the mountain, doing an eternally useless task. In front of the cliff were layers of thin and light clouds. They were like white paper, slowly flowing high and low between the cliffs. The red sun had long risen above the ocean, but it didn't seem to be much higher than the great Dong Mountain. Standing on the mountain, the sun seemed particularly close. The light passed through the white clouds and glowed with twisted and beautiful lines. Gradually, it made the pure white clouds even fainter until they almost disappeared into the air. Watch the clouds disappear and disperse, watch the rise and fall of the tide. Fan Xian unconsciously rubbed his nose and smiled self-mockingly. Why did he have to stand here by the emperor's side? Then, he saw the emperor's body sway. Fan Xian was shocked. Like lightning, he stretched out his hand. His left hand opened like a cattail leaf. His fingers bent slightly and exerted force. In an instant, the coffin breaker technique was unleashed. In a flash, he grabbed the emperor's hand and pulled him back a step. Below the two of them was a bottomless abyss. If they fell in, how could they survive? After Fan Xian's heart palpitated, he realized he had been rash. He apologized and greeted the emperor. He then noticed old eunuch Hong behind him glancing at him with a strange gaze. The emperor gently rubbed his forehead. He was not angry. On the contrary, he said self-mockingly, "Looks like I am indeed old. After looking for a long time, I feel a bit dizzy." Chapter 522. Federer, Federer, how helpless. Big tears. There is truly no perfect thing in the world. How can there be a godlike existence? Today is the last day of the festival. I sincerely ask everyone for a few more monthly tickets. Fan Xian's heart jumped. He lowered his head slightly and said a moment later, I do. Do you believe there are gods in the world? The emperor gazed at him calmly. Fan Xian replied straightforwardly, I do. He didn't know why the emperor was asking this question. For Fan Xian to be able to reincarnate into the land of the Qin kingdom, he, without question, deeply believed in such things as miracles. The Fan Xian of this life was not the Fan Shen of his previous life. He was a true idealist. Come with me. Fan Xian's head was filled with confusion as he followed the mysterious emperor toward the temple hidden among the trees at the top of the mountain. The name of Dong Mountain was widely known throughout the world. At first, it was known for its jade. Later, it became known for its miracles. Countless commoners who had no money for treatment had come here to worship the gods. Their illnesses had taken a great turn for the better. It was also revered as a holy land by the ascetic monks of the world. In the past, Fan Xian had always thought that the Qin temple was deliberately mystifying things. Foolish women and foolish people mistook psychological consolation for true healing. Now, the emperor's expression appeared very cautious. Could the Qin temple at the top of the mountain truly hear the will of heaven and be able to make contact with the illusory temple of legend? Harboring countless questions and slight excitement, Fan Xian followed the emperor around a quiet and secluded stone path and came to a particularly old temple behind the temple. The mountain wind was strong. It blew the bells under the eaves of the temple, making a clear and calming sound. It looked like the priests at the foot of the mountain had not lied. It was clear that the temples at the top of the mountain had not been repaired for many years. However, the mountain wind that had been blowing for thousands of years did not blow the old little temple into ruins. Looking at the style of the little temple's architecture and the dark and somber colors, Fan Xian's heart jumped. Involuntarily, he felt a sense of reverence, just like when he had first entered the Qin temple in Jingdou. At that time, the emperor had been inside the Qin temple, and he had been outside. Now, he had followed the emperor to a place that seemed to be out of this world. A strange feeling rose in Fan Xian's heart. The emperor seemed to be very familiar with this path, or perhaps everything about Dong Mountain. Standing outside the little temple, the emperor calmly said, "Don't be curious and don't get tired of listening. The reason is actually very simple. After meeting your mother in Danzhou, we did not miss out on the scenery of Dong Mountain. We once stayed here for a time." Although he didn't know how the emperor had guessed his thoughts, suddenly hearing these words, Fan Xian's mood immediately changed. Looking at the old buildings around him, his gaze carried a sense of familiarity and yearning. However, the emperor's following words immediately shattered Fan Xian's relaxed and joyful mood. The Lord of 10,000 creations does not enter unfathomable places. The emperor laughed coldly and repeated the words Fan Xian had used to admonish him in Danzhou yesterday. "I know what you have been worried about these 2 days. Let me ask you, if you were in Jingdou right now and you were that woman, what would you do?" Fan Xian did not feign fear. Instead, he sank straight into thought. He had thought about this question countless times. In the end, he realized that if internal strife occurred in Qin Kingdom and there were problems in Jingdou, the eldest princess, who was currently imprisoned in a side courtyard, only had one path to take. Perhaps she would do many things, but the center of everything, the foundation of everything, was just as the emperor had said yesterday. There was only one way to kill the emperor. First, I had to leave the Overwatch Council's surveillance and make contact with my own power, Fan Xian said without confidence. Fan Xian said with some uncertainty, "But, this matter must have started a few months ago. I don't think the eldest princess has this ability." The emperor coldly said, "Do you believe that 2 people could set a palace on fire? And in the early hours of a thunderstorm?" Fan Xian shook his head, not daring to show too much emotion. Through his own channels, he had learned the inside story of the change in the royal palace a few months ago. He knew that the Eastern Palace had caught fire at that time. It was the Crown Prince who had done this to save himself and alert the Empress Dowager. At the time, he had only been concerned with admiring the Crown Prince and his brother's actions. Hearing the Emperor's words, only now did he realize that there was something fishy about this matter. "I killed so many people, but she didn't resist at all," the Emperor said. Yet, she still had extra thoughts in the Eastern Palace to help the Crown Prince. "My sister's actions are always so incomprehensible. If she was able to avoid the Overwatch Council surveillance and make contact with her people, I would not find it strange at all." From this conversation, it could be heard that the Emperor had experienced the betrayal of his sister and son. Wrong. It should be said that after he had self-righteously forced his sister and son to betray him, or after the betrayal that had yet to come, his entire personality had changed slightly. He had already regarded Fan Xian, the illegitimate child who had not been by his side since childhood and had appeared particularly loyal and filial after entering the capital, as the most trustworthy person. However, this kind of trust made Fan Xian feel the pressure increase. He rubbed his slightly dry throat and glanced at the Emperor. If the eldest princess had already made contact with her people a few months ago, then she only needed to wait for an opportunity. "I think that now that you are far from Jingdo, it is the best opportunity. You only need to tell me what she will do. You don't need to constantly remind me of this." "Yes, I think that the eldest princess will use all of the power she has built over the past 20 years to strike like lightning at Dong Mountain or on the way back to the capital. Regardless of success or failure, she will seal off news of the Emperor and falsely announce to the world that the Emperor has met with misfortune and will be succeeded by the Crown Prince or the Second Prince. There's no need to say nonsense like success or failure. Since she is going to do it, she wants me dead." Fan Xian's analysis was very shallow and direct. If the eldest princess, Li Yunrui, could truly escape unscathed, she would certainly make this choice. The so-called plot, in the end, was still a matter of life and death, a matter of victory and defeat. As long as life and death had been decided, victory and defeat had been decided, she had the support of the princes in Jingdo and the Yi and Qin families. If she then threw the matter of the Emperor being assassinated onto Fan Xian, who could sit on that throne? Unless Chen Pingping led the pitiful 500 Black Knights and rebelled again. He lowered his head and said, "Since the Emperor has come, naturally, he has a well-thought-out plan." The Emperor glanced at him and faintly said, "What power can Yunrui have? The Juanshan Conference? Now that I think about it, I should have listened to Director Chen and you last year and wiped out that stupid conference. The Juanshan Conference is only an evacuation organization." Fan Xian repeated his father-in-law's reasoning. Fan Xian repeated his father-in-law's reasoning. "The key is what kind of power the eldest princess can mobilize. The Great Dong Mountain is by the sea and deep within the borders of the country. It is impossible to use an army to attack." The Emperor smiled coldly and said. The Emperor sneered and said, "The 10,000-mile stairway to heaven. If someone dares to assassinate me, they must first have the ability to ascend to heaven." Fan Xian lowered his head slightly. He understood what the Emperor meant. The Great Dong Mountain's position was very clever. It would be difficult to mobilize an army to attack. To the north, Danzhou's chain of tall mountains and cliffs blocked the last bit of danger for an army. Since there was no need to consider this, to assassinate the ruler of a country, especially the ruler of the most powerful country in the world, one could only use assassins. Normal people were completely meaningless. They couldn't even break through the outermost defensive ring of the Imperial Army, much less the hundreds of terrifying Tiger Guard aces on the summit of the mountain. Those who came did not have good intentions, and those with good intentions did not come. If the eldest princess truly wanted to assassinate the Emperor, one could imagine the skill of the assassins. "Yi Luyun is a guest of the Juanshan Conference," Fan Xian said quietly. Fan Xian said silently, the eldest princess does not have many aces herself. After experiencing the attack in the valley, I feel that some people in court are becoming more and more impudent. No matter what an impudent person does, it is not surprising. He was talking about the military elders in the Qing kingdom. If these people collectively stood against the emperor, what kind of situation would it be? The emperor did not continue Fan Xian's words. He only quietly said, my personal visit to Dong Mountain this time has not only confused you, but the two scholars also strongly opposed it. Yet, I still have to come. First, it is because I have stayed in the palace for too long. I want to come out and see the places I passed through in the past. Second, Chengqian hurt my heart. If I want to depose him, I will do so openly and not give anyone any chance to say anything. Fan Xian thought about it. The emperor beside him could probably be considered the most diligent and strangest emperor in history. After ascending to the throne, particularly after the end of the major battle, the emperor had never left Jingdou again. He did not go on the routine nationwide tours of a prosperous ruler. The emperor rarely even came out of the royal palace. Fan Xian only knew of the one time he had seen him outside Taiping courtyard. The emperor suddenly paused and smiled slightly. The third reason is very simple. I purposely wanted to give Yinrui a chance to see if that Juanshan conference could actually remove me as a monarch. Fan Xian shook his head and said, it is still the same words I said before. Why take the risk? Why come here? Your Majesty is the master of the world. With one edict, the remnants of the Juanshan conference will immediately fall to pieces. They are not worth mentioning at all. Is that so? But what about Yi Luyun? The emperor smiled slightly. His brows gradually relaxed. Fan Xian was speechless. Only now did he finally understand just how confident the emperor was. He was using himself as bait. What he was plotting was none other than Yi Luyun, the guest of the Juanshan conference. The great grandmaster of the Qing kingdom, Yi Luyun. This carefree warrior who floated overseas was in the wilderness while the emperor was in court. The two of them mutually checked and balanced each other. Only then did they create a loyal yet distant relationship between the Yi family and the royal family. If the emperor was able to kill Yi Luyun with his sword, then there would not be a sliver of power within the Qing kingdom that could shake the foundation of his rule. In other words, Yi Luyun had always been a malignant tumor in the emperor's heart. He had come to Dong Mountain to use the wonders of Dong Mountain to remove the tumor. Fan Xian still felt it was absurd. Even if you had over 100 tiger guards and eunuch Hong, that mysterious old creature, if the eldest princess moved, she would certainly have countless powers to cooperate with Yi Luyun. Even if Yi Luyun failed to assassinate the emperor, given the great grandmaster's otherworldly realm, how could you keep him? He had once personally experienced Yi Luyun toppling a building with half a sword in Hangzhou, so he knew the terrifying extent of Yi Luyun's power. Unless the Qing Iron Riders formed camps and endless volleys of arrows were used, perhaps it was possible to kill Yi Luyun on the plains. However, the emperor was on the lonely peak. Yi Luyun floated here and then away. He would not give the tiger guards the chance to surround him. As for the imperial soldiers at the foot of the mountain, due to the terrain, they were unable to form a cavalry charge formation. How can one kill a great grandmaster? This was something Fan Xian had thought about for an entire year. He had come up with many conclusions. Among them, the safest was to stand 500 meters away and use the assault rifle he had hidden like a precious son to snipe him. However, this kind of situation was not easy to create. The great grandmasters were elusive. Their senses were too powerful. It was impossible for them to stand there and give him too much time to aim. How could one kill a great grandmaster? In the end, Fan Xian thought of the most reliable method. It was to use two great grandmasters to kill a great grandmaster. This was a very senseless and wasteful way of thinking. 2 children would definitely be able to defeat 1 child. Of course, 2 stones were heavier than 1 stone. The problem was that great grandmasters were not products that could be mass-produced. They were rare geniuses. Who could find 2 great grandmasters? Thus, I had to come to Dong Mountain because I needed a person. This person will never leave Dong Mountain to suit my thoughts. The emperor looked at Fan Xian with a slight smile. He then pushed open the wooden door of the old temple. The wooden door creaked. Fan Xian's gaze drifted over. His heart tightened abruptly. Countless surprises and the irrepressible joy of a long separation flashed through his eyes. Yan Bingyun sat in a daze in a room in the Overwatch Council. He did not sit in that secret room because the director had returned to Jingdo in a wheelchair and returned to his own room. The power that Yan Bingyun had temporarily obtained had also been returned. He was the head of the 4th Bureau. His room was facing the street. The window was not covered with black cloth. The sunlight from outside seeped in and lit up the room. Standing at the window, he could clearly see the golden eaves of the royal palace. There was no master in the royal palace. The emperor's entourage should have already reached Dongshan Road, right? Yan Bingyun thought that ever since the emperor had left the capital, the people of Jingdo had all become well-behaved and didn't give the Overwatch Council too many problems. At this moment, everyone was afraid that the emperor, who was far away from Jingdo, would suspect something. Everyone knew the emperor's main purpose in offering sacrifices to heaven. He could not have the crown prince stay in the palace to supervise the country. Thus, the Empress Dowager once again closed the curtains. The imperial army that the great prince controlled became careful. The Jingdo garrison also increased patrols. Chapter 523. After getting a rough idea of the time, Yan Bingyun closed the window and sat back in his chair. He took out a beautifully embroidered pouch from his clothes and took out a few melon seeds from inside. He brought them to his lips and carefully chewed them. He appeared very bored. Only when his gaze landed on the pouch did he become warm and affectionate. This pouch had been embroidered by Lady Shen. Sir Yan Jr. had been particularly idle these past few days. He no longer needed to oversee council affairs, nor did he need to monitor court officials with the sensitivity of the 1st Bureau staff. Other than the daily affairs of the 4th Bureau, he did not have much to do. In the wilderness between Yanjing and Cangzhou, after Shang Shanhu had suffered a great loss at Yan Xiaoyi's hands, he had calmed down. Although the Northern Qi people had submitted a letter of reprimand, the accidental injury investigation was still ongoing. There were no unusual movements in Shangjing, and Dongyi was also very quiet. These were the things the 4th Bureau had to manage. Before the emperor left the capital, the 4th Bureau had already released enough fake news to ensure the silence of both sides. Yan Bingyun believed that given the Overwatch Council's power, even if the Northern Qi royal family and Sigujien knew of the emperor's tour, they would not be able to react in a short amount of time. Furthermore, he had no choice but to be relaxed. Even without these errands, the Jingdo center of the Qinian unit was still under Yan Bingyun's control. Logically speaking, for something as important as the emperor's tour, he should have notified Fan Xian ahead of time. However, what he did not understand was that once Director Chen returned to the capital, he suppressed this idea and firmly suppressed it. This was the question that had puzzled Fan Xian in Danzhou. Yan Bingyun still did not know that Commissioner Fan had already met up with the royal entourage. He was still faintly at a loss. At the same time, he was nervous. Jingdo appeared calm. With the imperial army, the Jingdo garrison, and Director Chen emanating a dark and terrifying aura, nothing major could happen. If something major was going to happen, it should be at the emperor's side, far away from Jingdo. Yan Bingyun smiled bitterly as he stood at the window and looked at Tianhe Avenue below and the royal palace not far away. His position was not high, but his role was complicated. He was the third most important person in the Overwatch Council and Fan Xian's trusted aide. However, his father had another identity. Most importantly, he was one of the young people the emperor had personally summoned into the palace. After a long night of conversation, he had another identity. No wonder Headmaster Chen suppressed him the moment he returned to the capital. Presumably, the headmaster also had some opinions about him. As for why Director Chen did not allow him to inform Fan Xian, Yan Bingyun, relying on his unique information from 3 places, vaguely guessed a sliver of the truth. He began to fear this truth. Even if Director Chen died by the emperor's side, would something big happen? That was why he wanted to go with the flow and get Fan Xian as far away from the royal entourage as possible. However, the director was so loyal to the emperor. No matter how much he loved Fan Xian, how could he place Fan Xian's safety above the emperor's life and death? Ding dong, the copper bell rang. The most special homecoming signal in the Jingdo Yamens rang out. Countless hurried officials walked out of the Overwatch Council Square building. They were not busy spreading evil water. They were in a hurry to go home. Special agents were also public servants, and the people in the Overwatch Council were all civil servants. They were no different from ordinary people. Yan Bingyun didn't have much to pack. He walked straight out of the building and sat in his family's carriage. Hurrying back to the Viscount's manor, he didn't go to chat with Sister Shen. Instead, he went directly to his father's study and asked, "Is there any news from the Qin family?" Yan Ruohai glanced at his son and shook his head. "You're in charge of the 4th Bureau in the council. Is there any movement from Shao Mountain?" Shao Mountain's location was special. It happened to be at the entrance of Dongshan Road. This place was in the northeast of the Qin kingdom and not far from Dongyi. Because no one dared to pass through the dense primordial forest between Danzhou and Dongyi, the transportation between the 2 places mainly relied on the sea or circled around Shao Mountain. Originally, there was not much power on Dongshan Road that could threaten the royal entourage. However, Shao Mountain just happened to be on the road from Dongshan Road back to the capital. The most important problem was that the Yan father and son both knew that the old Qin master's secret trusted soldiers had been trained in that mountain. The group that had attacked Fan Xian outside Jingdo at the end of the year had been moved over from Shao Mountain by the Qin family without the court's knowledge. Shao Mountain has been quiet. Ever since that incident, the council has been keeping a close eye on it with great attention. If there is any strange movement, it cannot be hidden from us. Yan Bingyun relaxed slightly and sat down. Yan Ruohai smiled slightly and said, "What we know is what the director knows and what the emperor knows. Since the emperor dares to take 2,000 imperial soldiers to Dong Mountain to worship heaven, it is either because he doesn't think much of the people in Shao Mountain or because he believes in the old Qin master's loyalty." Loyalty? Yan Bingyun sighed. Secretly assassinating important officials of the imperial court is considered loyalty? There are many levels of loyalty. Perhaps the emperor has already doubted the old master's loyalty after what happened last time. In reality, there is always a difference between an official and the emperor himself. Yan Ruohai paused and then asked seriously, "I have already retired and shouldn't ask, but I am still curious. Are there any problems in Dingzhou?" Yan Bingyun shook his head. At the beginning of the year, they beheaded 600 Hu people. They should have returned to the capital to report their success, but it is clear that Yi Zhong is also worried about the palace suspecting him, so he left the group in Dingzhou and did not return to the capital when the emperor was not present. He gently clenched the fist in his sleeve, wanting to speak but then hesitating. Yan Ruohai glanced at his son curiously and said, "You're not usually like this. If you have something to say, then say it." A faint suspicion rose to Yan Bingyun's frosty face. "I don't know if the emperor's safety can be confirmed." "What danger is there?" Yan Ruohai furrowed his brows. The Qing kingdom has 7 roads of elite soldiers. The 3 roads you suspect cannot get close to Dong Mountain. They are all under the council's watch. What about Yan Xiaoyi? Yan Bingyun stared coldly into his father's eyes. It was as if he wanted to see something else in them. Yan Ruohai very naturally turned his head and avoided his son's gaze. What about Governor Yan? There was a problem with the Zhangzhou victory. Yan Bingyun lowered his voice. I said that there was a problem with the Zhangzhou victory. The secret agents searching for military contributions have already reported back. Although the heads were disguised, there are some problems. You are the head of the 4th Bureau and have taken over my job. You should know that although killing people and stealing military contributions is a major crime, it has never been completely eradicated, particularly when it comes to these border generals. They require the court's additional rewards to balance out the misery of the cold border, Yan Ruohai said coldly. Besides, even if Yan Xiaoyi lied about his military contributions, what does it have to do with the emperor on Dong Mountain? Don't forget, Northern Qi's letter has already arrived. Would the Northern Qi people act with Governor Yan? That's what I'm afraid of, Yan Bingyun said coldly. Yan Bingyun coldly said, if it was just killing people and stealing military contributions, then that's fine. If this matter has something to do with Northern Qi, then I'm afraid it won't be so simple. Yan Ruohai slowly stood up and stared into his son's eyes. Enunciating each word, he said, do you know what you are saying? Do you think that just because the director and the commissioner let you temporarily take charge of council affairs, you are the most remarkable person in the world? That you can see through all the tricks in the world? Even if Governor Yan and the Northern Qi people are acting, what problem is there? What problem? Yan Bingyun looked at his father. A fire of anger burned in his chest. He angrily said, 5,000 people died in the Northern Expedition Army. Is this a great victory? 8,000 beheaded, I'm afraid more than half of it is fake. Did those 5,000 people die or not? If they didn't die, then where did the 5,000 people who disappeared without a trace go? He pointed at the table and the non-existent map of the Qing kingdom's borders. He angrily said, Father, although the northern expedition camp is between Zhangzhou and Yanjing, if we draw a straight line, it is less than 500 li from Dong Mountain. If these 5,000 people, who should have died, suddenly appear at the foot of Dong Mountain, what do we do? Yan Ruohai furrowed his brows. After a moment of silence, he suddenly said in a cold voice, Idiot. Although it is not far from Zhangzhou to Dongshan Road, one has to go around Shao Mountain. No one knows how many provinces they have to pass through. The distance is also more than 1,000 li. Do you think 5,000 people can go so deep into the country without a sound? What if they don't go around? Yan Bingyun did not yield an inch in front of his father. He spoke of all the confusion that had lingered in his heart these days. If Dongyi opened its gates and allowed those 5,000 dead people to pass through the vassal states, then what? What to do 2 in a row did not make Yan Ruohai nervous. He looked at his son and smiled coldly. Idiot. Even if those 5,000 people had truly become death soldiers as you say, even if Sigu Jian was as stupid as you to open the country's gates and not be afraid of the Qing army, have you thought about it? From Dongyi to Dong Mountain, one has to pass through Danzhou. No one can climb the high mountains and precipitous cliffs to the north of Danzhou. This was the truth. It was a truth that had been proven by maps, human eyes, and manpower. The primitive forests and mountain peaks to the north of Danzhou were not something mortals could climb, much less an army of 5,000 people. No one has been able to climb over before, but that doesn't mean that no one will ever be able to. Yan Bingyun thought of the geography and environment. His imposing manner weakened slightly, but he still did not give up. Straightforwardly, he said, besides, who knows if there are any secret passages in those mountains? Secret passages? Do you think this is a novel published by Donbua Bookstore? Yen Ruohai laughed coldly and prepared to walk out of the study. Seeing his father's completely unconcerned expression, Yen Bingyun finally couldn't resist. He slammed his palm onto the table with a loud bang and said angrily, "I don't know if what I'm worried about is a novel. I only know that what the Overwatch Council is doing right now is a joke. Regardless of whether or not this will happen, since there is already a point of suspicion, I will report it according to the Council's procedures. Why has the director suppressed this matter?" Hearing these words, Yen Ruohai's body shook. He slowly turned around and looked at his son with a complicated gaze. Yen Bingyun thought that his father had finally been convinced by him. A wave of relief rose in his heart. Unexpectedly, Yen Ruohai shook his sleeve and left the study. Summoning his trusted guards, he coldly said, "The young master is not feeling well. Have him stay in the manor to rest. Don't let him take a step out." The guards accepted the order in a low voice. After Yen Bingyun paused, a chill seeped into his heart. Staring at his father's back, he suddenly thought of the conversation he had with his father a long time ago. For a moment, he couldn't speak. That day, he asked his father, if, and I'm saying if, you had to choose between the palace and the council, what would you choose? At the time, Yen Ruohai had looked at him with an amused gaze and sighed. "Silly child, naturally, I would choose the council. If the old director did not have this confidence in me, why would he say so much to you?" Yen Bingyun took a step towards the door and was stopped by a guard who was highly skilled in martial arts. He did not put up any unnecessary struggle. He only sighed and asked his father, "Where are you going?" Yen Ruohai turned around and looked at his son with a smile. "Since you're sick, I have to go to the council to ask for leave for you." Yen Bingyun didn't say anything more. He was loyal to the emperor and the court. He had already done what he needed to do. After all, he was an official of the Overwatch Council. As his father's son, he could not do more. The Yi family is indeed too quiet. Yi Zhong is indeed too obedient. Offering a prisoner, such a good opportunity to enter the capital, yet he just let it go. Sitting in the wheelchair, Chen Pingping shook his head and said, "Of course, he is also afraid that the palace will be wary of him and something will go wrong ahead of time." However, the second prince must be muttering in his heart. He thinks that the crown prince is about to be deposed. If the crown prince acts blindly at this time, the second prince, with the support of the Yi family, will certainly be able to hold the fort alone. He is probably hoping for his father-in-law to return soon. Right now, everyone wants to act. No one has the ability or courage to be the first to act. The old man smiled slightly as he pushed the wheelchair over from the black cloth. "If you want to destroy yourself, you must make yourself crazy. The eldest princess is crazy enough." Yen Ruohai smiled and understood Director Chen's meaning. "But, you are in the capital. Even if she has thoughts, she will have to wait for news from there." Chen Pingping smiled slightly and said, "Our mighty emperor will certainly give the eldest princess a pleasant surprise. As for the news she is waiting for, she may never get it. But, what about Yen Xiaoyi's 5,000 elite soldiers?" Yen Ruohai furrowed his brows. "I still don't understand this. Even if he risked his life to save these 5,000 soldiers into the country, how would he transport them to the foot of Dong Mountain?" Yen Xiaoyi's actions in the Zhangzhou victory were done very well. Who would have thought that Yen Bingyun would still be able to see through it, Chen Pingping said with praise. "This child is truly not bad." Yen Ruohai forced a smile and said, "Usually, he pretends to be as cold as ice. When something big really happens, he still feels uneasy. He is not you or me. He doesn't know the emperor's plans." Chen Pingping sighed. "It is normal for him to be suspicious of you and me. After the matter, how will we explain it to the palace?" The emperor didn't want to beat the grass and startle the snake. Of course, the council cannot react to Yan Xiaoyi's actions ahead of time. Chen Pingping coughed and thought to himself that whether or not there would be an incident was the problem that needed to be considered. After Yan Ruohai left, the old cripple in the wheelchair pushed the wheelchair back to the window out of habit. Looking outside through the black cloth, the corners of his mouth twitched slightly. He thought that there was indeed a secret path from the vassal states of Dongyi through the mountains and through Danzhou to Dong Mountain. He knew about it, and the emperor also knew about it. However, looking at it now, the eldest princess also knew about it. Even if 5,000 people went, they would only be able to surround the entire mountain peak. At most, they would be able to control the transmission of information from the sacrificial ceremony. The only important thing in this entire matter was probably on that mountain peak. Chen Pingping used his withered right hand to scratch his grizzled hair. He thought to himself that he had missed something. Fan Xian had run to the summit. He could only hope that he would be lucky and not lose his life for no reason in that earth-shattering incident. The emperor had prepared a large surprise for the eldest princess and Yi Luyun. Was the eldest princess not going to prepare a surprise for the emperor? Chen Pingping tilted his head and leaned weakly against the wheelchair. He felt the taste of life slowly leave his body. However, he became excited because of the images that appeared in his mind. It was as if he had once again found some of the elements that had made him excited and fascinated in the past. The agitation in his mind caused him to cough. Although it was an incomparably satisfying cough, it also caused waves of pain in his chest. He subconsciously pressed the secret bell on the desk, only to discover that the person who opened the door was not Fei Jia. Only now did he remember that Fei Jia had already followed his wishes and left the troublesome Qing kingdom. At this time, he should already be in Chuanzhou, preparing to live the life that the old poison had long yearned for overseas. I'm coughing a little. Find some medicine to take. Chen Pingping smiled slightly at his subordinate who had just entered. If he could live another 2 years, then he would live another 2 years. The subordinate was overwhelmed by the favor and left with the order. Just as the emperor on the summit had guessed, as long as the eldest princess Li Yunrui did not die physically, she would always be able to find hidden power in Jingdou. At this moment, she was under house arrest in the side courtyard of the royal family. The people of the Overwatch Council were responsible for monitoring the outside, but her life was still maintained at a very luxurious standard. What was even more unexpected was that the Xinyang strategist, Yuan Hongdao, who had fled Jingdou for many months, had appeared in the side courtyard and sat in front of the eldest princess. No one knew how the eldest princess had done it. Even a blind person can see what the emperor is thinking. However, I don't know exactly where his confidence comes from. Li Yunrui's appearance was still beautiful, and her eyes were still charming and full of emotion. However, a truly attentive person could see that there was a slight change in her state of mind. Underneath the full emotion was a coldness carved deep in her heart. Chapter 524. In the quiet side courtyard of the royal family, a guard was patrolling outside the window. He seemed to be blind and deaf, unable to hear or see anything. The eldest princess, an important target of the royal family surveillance, was secretly plotting something with her trusted aide. He is too suspicious, so there is no need to plan anything. He will jump out and plan it himself. Li Yunrui slowly closed her eyes. Furthermore, he is very arrogant to the point that he can beat him at his own game. What nonsense! How could there be a plan? He's just playing by himself. She suddenly opened her eyes and said, however, I am afraid that brother will be lonely, so I can only play with him. The assassination on Dong Mountain seems to have become an absurd matter on the surface. He knows I want to kill him and is waiting for me to kill him. I know he is waiting for me to kill him, but I still want to kill him. It is truly interesting. Yuan Hongdao listened to this tongue twister and looked at the smile at the corners of the eldest princess' lips. He did not find it interesting. On the contrary, he felt a faint chill. She knew that Dong Mountain was a trap, yet the eldest princess had jumped in without a second thought. Did she really think that Yi Luyun, a great grandmaster, could change the entire world? Although he had become Li Yunrui's closest strategist after Huang Yi's death, he knew that although the eldest princess seemed to have been forced back step by the emperor and Fan Xian these 2 years and had never been able to do anything, in terms of strategy, there was not much she needed him for. Because of this, he had never figured out the details of the eldest princess' final plan. Naturally, he had no way to report it to the director and the emperor. As a strategist, at such a critical moment, regardless of whether it was for disguise or to gain more trust, Yuan Hongdao had to say some suggestions. Thus, he gazed into the eldest princess' eyes and quietly said, "Interesting. At certain times, it is the combination of absurdity and stupidity. I don't know which side is more absurd and which side is more stupid. Since the first to move was the emperor, then you should choose the other path. Otherwise, no matter how you move, your chess piece will always be one step slower than the person on the stone platform." The eldest princess Li Yunrui slowly closed her eyes. After a long silence, she said, "The other path? You're advising me not to move for now?" "Yes." The eldest princess suddenly opened her eyes and smiled. Her smile was extremely pure and innocent. "What's the use of not moving? If the worship to heaven on Dong Mountain successfully ends, there will come a time when Mother will go. Do you expect me to be imprisoned in this courtyard forever?" Yuan Hongdao was silent for a moment, then smiled. Since he could easily enter this courtyard, then the eldest princess must have many ways to easily leave this courtyard. He knew that the eldest princess was only thinking about the future of the Qing kingdom. No matter how you looked at it, if the emperor did not take advantage of this opportunity to leave the capital, what chance would the eldest princess have to stage a comeback? Fan Xian. Yuan Hongdao tried to persuade the eldest princess. Before he received further instructions from the council, he wanted to delay the eldest princess's actions as much as possible. "This is your chance. Fan Xian." The eldest princess became interested and smiled slightly. "Even if the emperor wants to take away Fan Xian's power in the future, this will not be my opportunity. It is not as simple as taking away power." Yuan Hongdao lowered his voice and said. "Fan Xian's relationship with the north is too close. Once the emperor has pacified the internal conflicts in the court, he will certainly point his blade at northern Qi. What Fan Xian will do at this time is worth considering. Perhaps that will be your opportunity. So I have to live?" The eldest princess smiled self-mockingly. "You have to live." She smiled lazily and did not comment. Her orchid-like finger tapped the teacup on the table. As Yuan Hongdao rose to pour her tea, she slowly lowered her face and thought quietly. Yuan Hongdao's thoughts were not wrong. However, he did not understand what kind of person the emperor was. In this world, only the eldest princess, Li Yunrui, knew best what kind of person her brother the emperor was. Only she knew that the emperor was giving her an opportunity. If she did not take advantage of this opportunity, there was no need to mention any future matters. The emperor had too many opportunities to kill her, but he did not. Naturally, he hoped to use her to draw out some people. The people of the Juanshan conference who had long been hidden in court, some strange old creature, she thought to herself that if she won, it wouldn't be a big deal. Even if she lost, it would be good if the emperor could achieve his goal. Thinking of this, a glimmer of a self-mocking smile once again appeared at the corners of her lips. "Brother Hong, what do you think is the final competition in killing?" The eldest princess looked at him with a slight smile. Yuan Hongdao thought for a bit and then said, "Time, opportunity, and the general trend." "Correct, but also wrong. The eldest princess slowly lowered her head and said. Actually, in the end, it's just a competition of the crudest, most boring, and most direct things, to see whose saber is faster and who has more fighters. Fighting for the throne is actually not fundamentally different from fighting for territory between gangs on the Jianghu. The emperor is overly suspicious and thinks that he can scheme against the world, but he has forgotten one thing. Not all the knives are in his hands. Don't forget what I said before. Because of his suspicions, he will, without a doubt, lose. The eldest princess' cold words set the tone for this entire matter. Yuan Hongdao smiled. He knew he could no longer convince the eldest princess, so he couldn't help but feel a bit anxious. However, he hid it well and said, the crown prince and second prince are almost done contacting them. Once the news arrives, they will begin to make arrangements. There shouldn't be any problems with the civil officials. Tragic news is always the best to strike at the civil officials' hearts. No matter what angle you look at it from, they have no reason to refuse. What you say is very reasonable, the eldest princess said with a slight smile. The eldest princess smiled slightly and said, the Overwatch Council cannot see the light. They are a powerful tool, but at times, they can never become a decisive force. With only the support of the officials and the support of the palace, what use can Chen Pingping have? She then smiled slightly and said, I heard that Wan has been taking care of the concubine who is about to give birth. Make arrangements for this matter. On the peak of Dong Mountain, Fan Xian stood outside the door and looked at the person sitting on the prayer mat. The blind man was covered by a black cloth. His figure was not very large, but he always appeared calm. He opened his mouth but didn't say anything. The emperor laughed and turned to leave, leaving this place to the uncle and nephew. Fan Xian walked in and carefully closed the door. After confirming that no one was eavesdropping, he allowed a joyful expression to overflow on his face. He hugged the blind man and gently patted his back. Wu Zhu still had that cold expression. This coldness was different from Sir Yen Jr.'s. It was not an expression of self-protection. Rather, it was a feeling brought about by the absolute calmness of one's heart. When Fan Xian hugged him tightly and was about to go mad with joy, the corners of the blind man's mouth opened slightly behind Fan Xian's head and revealed a rare warm smile. Unfortunately, Fan Xian did not see it. Otherwise, he would certainly do something strange. Wu Zhu was not someone who liked to be physically intimate with others. Fan Xian was also the same. However, meeting again after a long time, Fan Xian was unable to suppress the joy in his heart and embraced to his heart's content. The two of them sat separately on the prayer mats and looked at each other. They were silent for a long time and didn't speak. Fan Xian's expression became gentler and happier. He confirmed that the blind man's injuries were more or less healed. For a moment, he didn't know what to say or where to start. Ever since they parted a year and a half ago, he had gone south to Jiangnan to fight the Ming family, been ambushed in the valley, and killed people overnight in Jingdo. He had gone through countless dangerous situations. However, none of this was what Uncle Wu Zhu wanted to hear. These things were nothing to Wu Zhu. What was the Ming family? Wu Zhu did not care at all. As for the danger of being ambushed in the valley, Wu Zhu would only think that Fan Xian's performance was very poor. After holding it in for a long time, Fan Xian opened his mouth and said, "Uncle, I'm going to be a father." After hearing these words, Wu Zhu, whose expression did not change even under the pressure of Dong Mountain, fell into a rare silence. It was as if he was slowly digesting this news. Then, he tilted his head slightly and said, "You're also going to have a child?" No one knew how much information was contained in this word. For Wu Zhu, there were only two people in this world. Although there were tens of thousands of people, there were only two people to him. Nothing else existed. Only the matters of these two people were worthy of him remembering. 20 years ago, the woman had a child. 20 years later, the child the woman gave birth to was going to have a child. Although the two events were separated by 20 years, in his feeling, it was like two things had happened one after another. Thus, there was the word also. Then, a warm smile bloomed once again at the corners of his lips. Very seriously, he said to Fan Xian, "Congratulations." Because of this smile and these two words, Fan Xian sank into boundless shock and joy. He could not understand how, after not seeing Uncle Wu Zhu for more than a year, he would say such a vulgar word and not hesitate to show his most human side in front of him. When was the last time he had seen Uncle Wu Zhu smile? Probably when he was still in that grocery store in Danzhou talking about his mother. For some reason, Fan Xian's heart was warm. It was as if he felt that Wu Zhu was finally willing to smile for him, and not just because of Yi Qingmei. This was something worth remembering. Wu Zhu's smile immediately disappeared and returned to his usual appearance. "Seriously," he said, "when you're going to have a child, you have to say congratulations. This is what the lady taught me. I haven't forgotten, so don't be surprised." Fan Xian smiled bitterly and was speechless. He opened his mouth and said, "This should be an emotion that comes from the heart. We don't need to remember it." Wu Zhu's face faced the mural in the temple and said, "For me, this is a very difficult thing. For you, you are celebrating too early." The thin and absolutely opaque black cloth was tied around his eyes, making the bridge of his nose appear particularly straight. What he said next was also very direct. "The time is not right." The meaning of this sentence was too simple and too mysterious. A normal person would certainly not understand. But Fan Xian had lived with Wu Zhu since he was a child, so he easily understood the meaning contained in these 4 words. He laughed bitterly and nodded his head, acknowledging Uncle Wu Zhu's judgment. The emperor was worshipping heaven on Dong Mountain. If someone actually dared to rebel, then Dong Mountain would be the most dangerous place in the world. Correspondingly, Jingdou would be the second most dangerous place in the world. Fan Xian was far away by the seaside and had no way to worry about the situation in Jingdou. If the eldest princess and the princes truly had the courage to do such a thing, then what kind of methods would they use against Fan Xian, who appeared to be loyal to the emperor? Wan was the eldest princess' own daughter, so Fan Xian was not too worried. But, what about Cece and the child about to be born in her stomach? Even if the emperor had gained a great advantage on Dong Mountain, once Jingdou fell into chaos, what kind of harm would the people in the Fan Manor, the people Fan Xian worried about, suffer? This was the root of Fan Xian's shock and worry after seeing the emperor in Danzhou. However, in front of the emperor, he could not express anything. Only after Wu Zhu directly spoke of the root of the problem did his expression reveal the true emotions in his heart. It was a heavy one. The director and father are in the capital. There shouldn't be any major problems. He seemed to want to convince Uncle Wu Zhu but also to comfort himself. The emperor has not allowed Chen Pingping and Fan Jian to control the army. This is a problem. Wu Zhu's words still did not have any inferences, only results. He lowered his head and coldly said, "If you hurry back to Jingdou right now, perhaps you can still make it in time." Even if there were people in Jingdou rebelling, they still needed a reason. They had to find a scapegoat for the emperor's assassination. Thus, the time of the change in Jingdou had to be around 15 days after the Dong Mountain incident. If Fan Xian rushed back to Jingdou now, he should still make it in time. Wu Zhu said, "It's useless for you to be here." Fan Xian thought for a moment and then suddenly said, "My purpose seems to have been completed the moment I saw you." Ascending Dong Mountain and entering the old temple, the moment he saw Wu Zhu, Fan Xian understood why the emperor had ordered him to accompany him to worship heaven, why he had stopped him in Danzhou, and why he had brought him to Dong Mountain. Just as the emperor had said earlier, since this plan was targeted at Yi Luyun, he needed Wu Zhu's participation. Not only would Wu Zhu not leave Dong Mountain because of the emperor's plan, but even if he was on Dong Mountain, if he didn't want to attack Yi Luyun, he wouldn't attack. The emperor could order everyone under heaven, but he could not order Wu Zhu. Thus, the emperor needed Fan Xian's help to persuade Wu Zhu to participate in this matter. Presumably, you know why the emperor brought me to see you, Fan Xian said with his head lowered as he looked at Wu Zhu. You also know, Wu Zhu said. Fan Xian slowly raised his head. There was a complicated expression on his face. A moment later, he said, I've been in the capital for 3.5 years. I've done many things. In reality, I know that these things were all done by someone using me. Now, those people are using me to use you. It's fine with me because I have my own desires. But, you have no desires in this world, so this is unfair to you. There is no such thing as fairness or unfairness in this world, Wu Zhu said calmly. What is important is whether or not this matter benefits you. Fan Xian noticed something strange. After being separated from Uncle Wu Zhu for more than a year, the blind uncle seemed to be much more talkative than before. His expression was much more varied. He smiled bitterly and shook his head. The emperor has thrown himself into this dangerous situation. If we don't help him and he is actually killed by Yi Luyun's sword, things will get serious. He is using his own life and the turmoil of the world to force us to help him. Even if we don't care about these two things, I have to care about the safety of those people in Jingdo. Fan Xian paused and then smiled bitterly. If Yi Luyun acts, the eldest princess and the second prince will certainly have reached an agreement in Jingdo. We can't let them succeed. Wu Zhu was silent for a moment and then said, Speak frankly. Fan Xian sat down in front of him and said sincerely, Uncle, please protect the emperor's life. As for Yi Luyun, don't worry about him. Wu Zhu nodded straightforwardly. Fan Xian let out a breath in his heart. The emperor could use him, but he didn't want to use Uncle Wu Zhu. He only had a few family members in this world. He didn't want too many other things mixed in. Letting Uncle Wu Zhu act did not mean that Fan Xian wasn't worried about his safety. The strange activity before the heaven worship would certainly be the greatest tremor in this land in 20 years. Even if Uncle Wu Zhu had the cultivation of a great grandmaster, he might not be able to get away with it. However, Fan Xian was not very worried because this temple was on the precipice of a high mountain. Even if Uncle Wu Zhu lost in the end, he could just jump into the ocean. With this trick, Yi Luyun and those big shots would not be able to catch up even if they whipped their horses. I should go down the mountain right now, Fan Xian said with his head lowered. In the major event that was about to happen, he didn't have much right to speak. Furthermore, in the depths of his heart, he didn't want to follow the emperor in this crazy risk. He knew that the emperor probably wouldn't let him leave the mountain. Only by using this method of kidnapping hostages well could he move Uncle Wu Zhu to work for him. If Yi Luyun's sword occasionally turned and pointed at Fan Xian, Wu Zhu would have no choice but to act even if he didn't want to. If the other party makes a move, it will certainly be before the heaven worship is complete. In a moment, I will try to convince the emperor to let me leave the mountain. Fan Xian furrowed his brows. After this matter is over, please come find me as soon as possible. Speaking of this matter, he looked at Uncle Wu Zhu's face and asked in a daze, I don't know what is so special about the heaven worship ceremony or what symbolic meaning it has, but I am curious. Uncle, have you been recovering on Dong Mountain this year? Wu Zhu nodded. Everyone says that the Great Dong Mountain is magical. Is it true? Fan Xian looked at the black cloth on his face and asked with furrowed brows. Wu Zhu opened his mouth and said, I don't know if it's useful for those people's illnesses, but it's very beneficial for my recovery. Fan Xian's heart trembled slightly. He didn't quite understand these words and asked, why? The yuanqi on Dong Mountain is thicker than anywhere else in the world, Wu Zhu said. Fan Xian's brows furrowed even tighter. I can't feel it. You can only feel the zhenqi in your body, Wu Zhu said. The yuanqi between heaven and earth is not so easily captured. He paused for a moment and then said, he once practiced Western magic. He should be able to feel it. Fan Xian was silent. He suddenly thought of the two useless sorcerers who had occasionally appeared in his life. He seemed to have vaguely guessed something, but he was unable to connect all the clues together. Magic, this was such a distant and unfamiliar term. When he was young, he had once thought of cultivating magic, but on this land, no one was proficient in it. Even He, who was more of a collection and research of theoretical knowledge. The night gradually deepened. The temperature at the top of the mountain slowly dropped. The insects in the grass were so cold that they stopped chirping. A somber aura gradually condensed between the temples. Fan Xian raised his face in a daze and looked at the murals painted on the four walls of the temple. The pictures were similar to those in the Qing temple in Jingdou. It made him slightly absent-minded. Fan Xian was filled with curiosity toward the temple and the Qing temple that followed its style. He had wanted to ask Uncle Wu Zhu, but the pressing situation made it impossible for him to stay for too long. He stood up and bowed to Wu Zhu. Lowering his voice, he said, on this mountaintop, it doesn't matter who dies, but you cannot die. Wu Zhu didn't reply. He tilted his ear and then extended his right hand from his sleeve. He pressed it directly to the ground and didn't move at all. A moment later, Wu Zhu quietly said, you won't be able to get down the mountain. You've convinced him. The emperor held his hands behind his back and stood at the edge of the pitch-black cliff. There were clouds in the sky, hiding the moon behind a thick layer of clouds. The distant blue ocean below the cliff was suffused with a dark color like ink. One could faintly see one or two weak spots of light. They should be the Jiaozhou Navy's escorting ships. Fan Xian walked behind the emperor and furrowed his brows slightly. In the afternoon, he had almost fallen off. How exactly did the emperor train his courage? However, the situation was urgent. He didn't reply to the emperor's question. Straightforwardly, he said, Your Majesty, there are riders attacking from the foot of the mountain. The emperor slowly turned around with a slight smile on his face. He didn't question how Fan Xian knew what was happening at the foot of the mountain from the top. Gently, he said, Is that so? How many people are there? I'm not sure. Fan Xian lowered his head and replied, I think that since the enemy is attacking, we should immediately send out the tiger guards to break out and ask for help. The emperor looked at him calmly and didn't reply to his words. He only slowly said, I have something else for you to do. At the foot of the mountain, a fire arrow shot through the night sky with a whoosh. It lit up a bit of the sky and reported the urgent enemy situation at the foot of the mountain. At the foot of the mountain, the sounds of killing had probably shaken the heavens and blood and flesh flying everywhere. The curtains had been drawn on the most daring act of regicide in the history of the Qing kingdom. Report. The deputy commander of the imperial army ran out of the camp at the top of the mountain and knelt in front of the emperor. He quickly reported what had happened at the foot of the mountain. However, the distance between the summit and the foot of the mountain was very far. It was impossible to completely understand the specific situation with just a few command arrows. The deputy commander's face was deathly pale. He was drenched in sweat in the cold night wind. He only knew that there was an enemy attack at the foot of the mountain. This reality was enough for him to lose his head. He truly couldn't understand how these attacking troops had come to the foot of Dong Mountain without alerting the local government. Under the cover of the night, they had launched a fierce and tragic attack on the 2,000 imperial soldiers at the foot of the mountain. There was no specific content. Fan Xian watched as the deputy commander's lips moved up and down. It was like he couldn't hear a single word in his ears. It was like an absurd and laughable soundless scene. It was indeed laughable. The ruler of a country was surrounded on Dong Mountain deep within the country. The sound of killing could not reach the high summit of the mountain. The stench of blood also could not float up. The summit of Dong Mountain was still clear and bright. In the night sky very close to the summit, the thick layer of clouds suddenly dissipated and revealed a bright moon. The moonlight was like a silver ray shining on the emperor and Fan Xian's bodies at the summit. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes slightly and looked at the emperor's godlike figure enveloped in the moonlight. He began to feel nervous and excited. Through the emperor's iron-like shoulders, he saw a small boat floating in the distance on the ocean. The small boat rose and fell in the waves. Leisurely moving forward in the moonlight, it headed toward Dong Mountain. The summit of the mountain was far from the ocean, but Fan Xian still felt the small boat. Yi Luyun was standing on the boat. Chapter 525. The moon was as cold as water. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at the distant foot of the mountain and the distant seaside. He saw the small boat gently sinking and floating in the ink-like water. His internal strength was tyrannical and his eyesight was astonishing. He still could not clearly see the situation on the boat. Strangely, it was as if he could see the old man on the boat, that straw hat, and that wisp of beard from so far away. Of the 4 great grandmasters in the world, he had only seen Yi Luyun. Once when he was young and once in Suzhou. Each time, he was stunning. Yi Luyun was a free and easy person, a very free and easy person. Tonight, he had come riding a boat through the waves with a sword in hand. His aura had not yet arrived, but his elegance was already enough to make one's heart tremble. Fan Xian looked at the boat in the ocean and thought of the great grandmaster who had floated alone on the boat and charged toward Dong Mountain. Even though there were thousands of people in front of him, he couldn't help but feel deeply moved. A glimmer of respect grew in his heart for no reason. The small boat appeared close but was actually very far. It bathed in the moonlight on the shore of an antenna and slowly moved toward this side. It was as if it would never get close to this shore. Fan Xian knew that the furthest distance in the world was not the distance between life and death. Thus, this small boat, which was about to determine the life and death of countless people, would eventually reach the shore. At the foot of the mountain, on the side facing away from the shore, dots of fire suddenly appeared. Although they were dots of fire, the light was enough to reach the summit of the mountain. It could be imagined that on the battlefield there, powerful rebel soldiers had appeared like ghosts and were desperately attacking the line of defense of the imperial army. The power of the fire when they burned the camp had already grown to an uncontrollable level. Fortunately, there was a lot of rain in the summer. Additionally, the sea wind blew and the mountain was very humid. There was no need to worry that this fire would directly burn Dong Mountain into a charred pillar and burn everyone on the mountain to death. A few more mournful signal arrows shot into the sky. They only reached halfway up the mountain before falling miserably and dispiritedly and powerlessly. It was at this time that the Imperial Army's line of defense at the foot of the mountain found it difficult to continue and almost couldn't hold out much longer. The little boat had not yet arrived, but the powerful enemies had already reached the foot of the mountain. The Qing Emperor and his group all had their backs to the sea. Standing in front of the stone railings for viewing the scenery, they silently watched the activity at the foot of the mountain, watched the fires that burned and died, and listened to the faint sounds of killing. However, they were still too far away. When the sounds of battle reached the peak of the mountain, they were blown by the wind and rustled by the branches of the trees. It actually became a somewhat distorted rhythmic beat. There was no killing intent. At least, the people on the summit of the mountain did not feel this kind of atmosphere. In comparison, the little boat slowly drifting over from the ocean behind Dong Mountain brought more nervousness to the people. At this time, the minister of the Board of Rites, the officials of Taichung Temple, and the other officials who had come to worship heaven had long walked out of their rooms and followed behind the silent emperor. Each of them was shocked and terrified, but no one dared to say anything. The deputy commander of the imperial army had long charged down the mountain, prepared to fight to the death on the front line. However, before he arrived, the 2,000 soldiers of the imperial army would probably have already become wandering spirits in the night and corpses in the mountains. Fan Xian felt a slight bitterness in his mouth. He unconsciously stuck out his tongue to lick his dry lips. A glimmer of shock grew uncontrollably in his heart. Where did this army at the foot of the mountain come from? Why didn't the Overwatch Council's network on Shandong Road detect anything ahead of time? Why didn't the 500 Black Knights placed in the Shao Mountain area have any effect? Was the other party able to sneak to the foot of Dong Mountain without anyone noticing? What shocked him the most was the situation at the foot of the mountain. Seeing the flames retreating, listening to the rise and fall of the sounds of killing, and judging from the signal arrows, he knew that the imperial army could no longer hold out. The 2,000 imperial soldiers were about to be defeated so quickly. Although the imperial army was stationed in Jingdo and could not compare to the Dingzhou army, Northern Expedition Camp, and the Seven Roads of armies in terms of field battle ability, ever since the Great Prince had been transferred to the position of commander of the imperial army, he had transferred many key generals from the original Western Expedition Army. The imperial army's strength had been effectively replenished. Even if they were not a match for those armies, they would not be defeated so quickly. After Fan Xian was shocked, a glimmer of confusion welled up in his heart. Whose family did the attacking army belong to? It's Yan Xiaoyi's trusted camp. The emperor stood by the stone railing and looked in the direction of the foot of the mountain. Although it was clear that he could not see clearly what was happening below, he saw a glimmer of unease in Fan Xian and old eunuch Hong's eyes. Coldly, he said, the imperial army is not a match for them. Yan Xiaoyi's trusted camp? Fan Xian furrowed his brows. He immediately thought of the strange Cangzhou victory between Cangzhou and Yanjing a month ago. Although he still didn't know what method Yan Xiaoyi had used to send these soldiers to the foot of Dong Mountain, since the enemy had already arrived, thinking about it now was a waste of time. You are the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. An army has traveled thousands of li to carry out an attack deep inside the country. What crime is that? The emperor looked at Fan Xian and asked with a slight smile. Fan Xian laughed bitterly. He knew that the emperor was joking. However, the situation at the foot of the mountain was so dangerous. He was not in the mood to joke. He replied, even if there is a secret passage to the north of Danzhou, the Overwatch Council should have received news of it. Thus, I think that someone in the council is helping him. The emperor smiled and didn't say anything. There was an additional glimmer of self-mockery in his smile. Fan Xian saying that there was a problem in the council was honest and also a test. He wanted to test whether or not the elite group at the foot of the mountain, killing like tigers and wolves, Yan Xiaoyi's trusted camp, had been purposely let there by the emperor. Looking at the emperor's confident expression and calm posture, Fan Xian believed this deduction in the depths of his heart. However, the emperor's smile appeared very helpless. I want to know the specific situation at the foot of the mountain, the emperor suddenly said coldly. I don't want to be blind. Back then, the emperor had personally led the army to fight north and south. He had made illustrious achievements in battle and could be called the foremost general in the land. However, he had not personally gone into battle for almost 20 years. That was why Shang Shanhu, who was fighting the barbarians in northern Qi, had gradually overshadowed the monarch's military glory. In the situation of the royal entourage being surrounded, if the emperor could personally command the imperial army, presumably, the imperial army at the foot of the mountain would not have been defeated so wretchedly. However, even though there was a bright moon hanging high in the night, going up and down the mountain was not as joyful as singing folk songs. Sending orders took a long time, much less personally commanding. Thus, the emperor's expression was icy and his tone was not friendly. This slight unfriendliness did not frighten the people by the emperor's side to death. In such a situation, the emperor was sufficiently calm that he did not fly into a rage and chop off the heads of the officials by his side. Fan Xian slowly lowered his head and gently touched the index and ring fingers of both of his hands, forming a bridge. In an instant, he circulated all the tyrannical zhenqi in his body, urging the two circulations in his body that were different from everyone else's to circulate quickly. He forced his six senses to the clearest realm. In an instant, the aura on his body grew greatly, stirring up a gust of wind on the summit of the mountain. The sand and stones moved slightly. The tiger guards guarding the emperor's side were startled. At such a sensitive moment, they all made defensive movements. Only old eunuch Hong was standing behind the emperor in a half-asleep state. A moment later, Fan Xian respectfully reported, "Your Majesty, it is a bit strange. The other party seems to have retreated." Hearing these words, the emperor's brows furrowed. A moment later, he faintly said, "Just how many people did he bring?" He dared to try to seal off the entire mountain and not let a single person out. Yan Xiaoyi has a big appetite. The officials on the summit, including Fan Xian, were all confused. Only the emperor clearly determined the rebel army's intentions. They gave the imperial army a chance to regroup. They were afraid that the two sides would fight and enter a chaotic situation, leaving some survivors out of this large net. The rebel army at the foot of the mountain was prepared to not let a single person escape Dong Mountain and report to the surrounding provinces. "Impossible," Fan Xian said. He knew that according to the Overwatch Council's procedures, the 6th Bureau swordsmen mixed with the Imperial Army would find an opportunity at the first instant to break out of the heavy encirclement and inform the Dongshan Road government to urgently mobilize the provincial and nearest troops to come to their aid. Given the ability of the 6th Bureau swordsmen to move in the dark, even if there were tens of thousands of riders at the foot of the mountain, they would not be able to kill or capture all of these swordsmen. There would always be a few people that would be missed. A shadow-like gray-clothed man floated up from the 10,000 steps to heaven. This person's qigong was excellent, but his posture was strange. It was as if there was a spring installed in his knee joints. Each time he touched the ground, he bounced up gently. Although his posture was not as graceful as that of a powerful warrior, it was superior in that he was fast and quiet. Before the gray-clothed man reached the summit, countless snowflakes had already bloomed in the night sky. The tiger guards hiding around the emperor raised their long knives and chopped down. In an instant, they covered up the splendor of the moon. The gray-clothed man did not attack. He only held up a token. Under the moonlight and knife light, the token was very obvious. It was the token of the Overwatch Council. Eunuch Ya waved his hand. The tiger guards pulled back their knives, but they still revealed themselves. They surrounded the gray-clothed man in the center. A dozen long knives pointed in a threatening manner. Fan Xian believed that even if he was between these dozen long knives, he would only be able to run for his life. However, he took a step closer to the gray-clothed man with a questioning and worried expression on his face. The gray-clothed man was one of the two wings of the Overwatch Council, Wang Qinian. He was Fan Xian's trusted aide. When the sudden change occurred, he had led the Overwatch Council people to set up defenses at the foot of the mountain. He had long been shocked beyond words. He didn't say much to Fan Xian. Surrounded by the knife-wielding men, he knelt in front of the emperor and Fan Xian. In a low voice, he said, 5,000 rebel soldiers, armed with crossbows, all of them archers. At the same time, everyone on the summit fell silent because of this news. First of all, this news proved the emperor's judgment. The attacking rebel soldiers were Yan Xiaoyi's trusted soldiers. Only a god of archery like Yan Xiaoyi could train all of his trusted soldiers into 1 in 1,000 master archers. Although the distance of an arrow was not as far as a crossbow, it was faster than a crossbow. 5,000 master archers had attacked in the dark. It was said that Yan Xiaoyi's trusted soldiers were all longbowmen. No wonder the Imperial Army and Overwatch Council people at the foot of the mountain had such difficulty resisting. The Emperor looked at Wang Qinian kneeling in front of him and asked in a low voice, "How is the battle situation?" Wang Qinian's tone froze. He immediately replied, "When we were attacked, I went up the mountain. I do not know the current situation." The Emperor huffed coldly but did not continue to express his dissatisfaction. It had not been long since the attack. The distance between the top and bottom of the mountain was very far. Other than the signal arrows, Wang Qinian was the first official to rush to the top of the mountain to report. Looking at his deathly pale face, one could tell that this short charge up the mountain had used up most of his spiritual and internal strength, 5,000 longbowmen. The Emperor suddenly laughed coldly. They want to wipe out 2,000 imperial soldiers. Xiaoyi does not have such ambitions. I am truly curious who the master at the foot of the mountain is. The rebel soldiers had sealed the mountain and were not attacking. The situation was a bit strange. Fan Xian looked at Wang Qinian and straightforwardly asked, "Have we broken through?" The Overwatch Council acted according to protocol. If a superior asked a question, the subordinate knew what it was. Wang Qinian's expression changed slightly. He reported to Fan Xian, 17 members of the 6th Bureau, all dead. Fan Xian's expression did not change. "Are you sure?" "Yes." Wang Qinian lowered his head and reported. "I turned back halfway up the mountain. There were battles on the two quiet paths to the southwest and northwest. There were aces lying in ambush." Fan Xian's pupils constricted slightly. His heart ached for a moment. He forcefully pushed down the growing anger and sorrow. The 6th Bureau always walked in the dark. Among Yan Xiaoyi's trusted soldiers, where would there be such swordsmen who were used to assassinations? To be able to kill all of his subordinates in the darkness proved that the assassins were of a much higher level than the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau. He then glanced deeply at Wang Qinian. Wang Qinian did not nod or shake his head. He only moved his right hand, which was on the ground, slightly. Fan Xian sighed in his heart. He knew that 13th Wang was fairly well behaved and relaxed a little. Turning to look at the Emperor, he didn't hesitate. Without hesitation, he calmly said, "Your Majesty, Dongyi's people have also come." Hearing these words, the Emperor did not react at all. It was as if he was waiting for something. A moment later, Eunuch Yao walked back from the stone steps and quietly said something by the Emperor's ear. The Emperor's expression gradually darkened. Only now did Fan Xian know that when the first warning arrow had risen, Eunuch Yao had already arranged for the Tiger Guards to begin breaking out of the encirclement and send a message. Now, he had received a report confirming that the breakout had failed. The swordsmen of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council and the valiant Tiger Guards had twice tried to break out of the encirclement but had both failed. Just how many aces had Dongyi lent to the eldest princess? Had the Sword Hut, which produced the most 9th-level aces in the world, all gathered at the foot of Dong Mountain? Had Sigurjian come? The night wind rose again on the summit of the mountain. The little boat on the distant ocean was still both far and near. The sounds of killing at the foot of the mountain gradually died down. The moonlight shone on the mountain woods but could not brush away the darkness in the woods. No one knew how much hidden killing intent was waiting for the people on the summit of the mountain. The Emperor suddenly thought of the scene of Fan Xian circulating his qi earlier and coldly asked, "Your martial arts are getting better. Has the old illness from last year recurred?" Fan Xian didn't understand why the Emperor would suddenly ask such an irrelevant question at this time. He replied, "It has not recurred." "Very good." The Emperor calmly gazed at the vast land under the moonlight. "Then, I will leave this matter to you with peace of mind. Get out." The emperor roared darkly and angrily. On the summit of the mountain, other than the emperor, Fan Xian, old eunuch Hong, and the tiger guards hidden in the darkness, everyone else obeyed the order and rolled back into their temples and residences, leaving this place empty for the emperor and the commissioner, the pitiful father and son. My journey to worship the heavens this time was a gamble. What I worship is the heavens, and what I gamble on is also the heavens. A seriousness flashed between the emperor's brows. I don't want to wait any longer, so I am gambling with my life. I am gambling on the fate of heaven. Whether it succeeds or fails, it is all within my calculations. If it succeeds, the Qing court will no longer have internal worries. Within 3 years, the sword will point to the world, and no one will dare to slow my steps. However, he did not say what would happen if he failed. Coldly, he said, perhaps I have calculated wrongly. Tonight, I lured Uncle Luyun up the mountain. I had thought those two people would not interfere. After all, this is the Qing kingdom breaking its own pillars. If it had been in the past, they would have stood by and watched. Fan Xian stood silently to the side. He was certain that the 9th-level aces from Dongyi were participating in the rebel army at the foot of the mountain. As for whether or not Sigu Jian would come, no one could guess. Even if that idiot comes, so what? However, the emperor slowly closed his eyes and sighed. I must consider what comes after, so you can go down the mountain. Fan Xian raised his head in surprise, not knowing how to respond. He had thought for a long time about how to convince the emperor to let him go down the mountain. He had not expected the emperor to bring up this idea himself. However, the paths down the mountain were all sealed. In addition to the terrifying 9th-level swordsman from Dongyi, how could he go down the mountain? The emperor smiled mockingly and said, "Do you think I will drag you by my side and force Lao Wu to act?" Fan Xian smiled helplessly. The emperor took a deep breath. It was as if he wanted to suck in all of the moonlight on the summit of the mountain into his chest. A moment later, he said in a cold voice, "Regardless of whether or not I succeed, Jingdo will certainly say I am dead. Thus, I want you to go down the mountain. I want you to go back." He looked calmly into Fan Xian's eyes and said, "Of my 4 sons, 2 of them are worse than pigs and dogs. Go back to the capital on my behalf and teach them a lesson. Don't disappoint me." The emotions in Fan Xian's heart were complicated. He then heard the emperor's words that were even gentler than the sea breeze. "There is no need to stay here to gamble your life with me. Go back to the capital. If the outcome of the matter is not what I imagine, you can do whatever you want. You decide who sits in that chair." Fan Xian's heart shook. He was speechless. Chapter 526. There were 3 reasons for Fan Xian's shock. First, the emperor sending him down the mountain contained a glimmer of pity for his son. It was truly unexpected. Second, the emperor's words seemed to no longer have his usual confidence. Third, the emperor's last words, "Who would sit in that chair and let him decide?" Were those last words or something else? The problem was, even if he was lucky and could make it back to Jingdo before the eldest princess announced the truth, what power did he have to turn his ideas into reality? This was not the Jiangnan Ming family, the Cui family, the court officials in Jingdo, or the pitiful people in the imperial observatory. It was the royal palace and the ownership of the world. A bitter smile appeared at the corners of Fan Xian's lips. Even if he was a powerful official in the Qing kingdom, he didn't have a single soldier in his hands. What could he use to help the emperor stabilize Jingdo? What right did he have to decide the ownership of that chair? "I will not lose." A glimmer of a smile bloomed at the corners of the emperor's lips. The smile was filled with cold killing intent. "Even if I lose, if Yi Luyun and Sigu Jian accompany me in death, what is there to be afraid of? You don't have to worry. Director Chen is in Jingdo, and the Empress Dowager is in the palace. Those people won't be able to cause much trouble. Take my edict and my royal seal. If anyone dares to stop you, kill them all. Cold sweat beaded on Fan Xian's forehead. If the Yi and Qin families also rebelled, even if he was a great grandmaster, the most he could do was fight a guerrilla battle. How could he kill them all? He could already see the glimmer of uncertainty in the emperor's heart. His mood couldn't help but grow dim. If the emperor truly died on Dong Mountain, what would the world become? Regardless of whether it was the crown prince or the second prince succeeding, there would probably be no place for him in the Qin kingdom. Did he really have to hold on to that treasure bowl and take the second path? However, the situation had not reached its most dangerous moment. There was still old eunuch Hong and Uncle Wu Zhu on the mountaintop, as well as over 100 tiger guards. No matter what kind of powerful enemy they encountered, they would be able to hold out for a long time. There was only one way to forcefully climb Dong Mountain. The mission of the 5,000 longbowmen at the foot of the mountain was clearly to cut off Dong Mountain's connection to the rest of the world. It had to be cut off for at least 3 days to make time for the Jingdo incident. If they truly wanted to kill the emperor, these rebel soldiers would not be of any use. The emperor would not stupidly go down the mountain. And then Yi Luyun would climb the mountain. This was indeed a gamble. If the situation of the three countries remained the same as before, the ruler of Qin Kingdom setting up a trap to kill Yi Luyun, northern Qi and Dongyi would certainly be happy to see it succeed. Ku He and Sigu Jian would not cast aside their identities and interfere. But, the cold sweat on Fan Xian's forehead had already dried. His body only felt cold. When he was in Wuzhou, his father-in-law Lin Ruofu had reminded him that for a sufficiently alluring and even somewhat gorgeous goal, the great grandmasters might naturally walk together. The bitterness in Fan Xian's mouth grew. If the situation continued to develop like this, how could there be anyone left alive on Dong Mountain? But could it be that the emperor did not predict this situation from the very beginning? He carefully glanced at the emperor's face and found that the emperor's expression was somewhat gloomy. In the night, his pupils were flashing with flames. He didn't continue thinking about these questions. He quickly analyzed the situation in front of him in his mind. The outcome of the battle at Dong Mountain was unknown. If it reached a stalemate, there would be problems in Jingdo. He had to bring the news that the emperor was still alive to Jingdo and the Empress Dowager's side. Even if the emperor died and he returned to Jingdo, he had to let the Empress Dowager believe that the emperor was still alive. Otherwise, given the judgment of a political figure like the Empress Dowager, once she learned of the emperor's death, she would certainly choose to have the Qin family protect the crown prince's ascension to the throne and stabilize the Qin court. The emperor was her son. If someone wanted to harm the emperor, the Empress Dowager would certainly not allow it. If the emperor's death became a certain reality, as the oldest member of the royal family, the Empress Dowager had to consider the continued existence of the entire royal family and the survival of the world. Regardless of whether it was for his own safety or the situation in Jingdo, Fan Xian knew that the emperor's arrangements were correct. He had to bring the emperor's personally written letter and royal seal back to Jingdo to stabilize the situation and deal with the post-Grandmaster era. In the post-Grandmaster era, regardless of who won or lost in the battle at Dong Mountain, there would certainly be 1 or 2 great grandmasters who would leave the stage of history. He nodded silently and said, "Please rest assured, Your Majesty. Nothing will happen to Jingdo." The emperor glanced at him deeply and said, "The road ahead will be difficult and dangerous. You must be careful." Fan Xian was slightly startled. Originally, in the depths of his heart, he had been full of mockery and self-mockery toward the emperor's earlier words, "I have 4 sons." Unexpectedly, after hearing these words, his heart softened slightly. Fastening his belt and confirming that he was fully equipped, Fan Xian quickly changed from an official to a 9th-level night walker. He restrained his aura from head to toe. It was as if he wanted to become one with the scenery at the summit of Dong Mountain. Only the infuriating silver moonlight shone unharmoniously on his body. He carried the emperor's royal seal and the letter to the Empress Dowager. They were not very heavy, but he felt very heavy. He knew that the news of Dong Mountain being surrounded would certainly return to Jingdo soon. At the same time, the news that would return would be that the emperor had been assassinated. The eldest princess had used the perfect time difference. She didn't even need to prepare anything in Jingdo. As long as she confirmed the emperor's death, the Empress Dowager would have to walk out sorrowfully from behind the curtain and choose one of the three princes to inherit the throne. At this time, the worship to heaven had not been completed. The heavenly edict had not descended. Although everyone under heaven knew that the crown prince was about to be deposed, the crown prince was still the crown prince. Regardless of whether one looked at it from the perspective of the stability of court politics or any other angle, the Empress Dowager would choose the crown prince to inherit the throne. This was not a conspiracy. It was just taking advantage of the situation. Even if the emperor had countless backup plans in Jingdo and Chunpingping and the imperial army were equally loyal, once the news of the emperor's death spread through the world, who would openly disobey the Empress Dowager's edict? Unless they wanted to rebel a second time. Fan Xian stretched his limbs as if he wanted to lighten the burden on his body. He knew that he was essentially carrying the Qin Kingdom's dragon chair on his back. After all, they are your brothers. The emperor stood beside the black-clothed Fan Xian and coldly said. The emperor stood beside the black-clothed Fan Xian and coldly said, "If we can avoid killing, we won't, particularly Chengzi. If I have to, then I'll kill them all." Fan Xian's heart trembled slightly and he nodded. The corners of the emperor's lips twitched slightly. Gazing at the little boat in the distance, he mockingly said, "Why is Uncle Luyun so slow? As a great grandmaster, do you still have uncontrollable cowardice when facing me? Do you still need helpers?" Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything. He raised his head to glance at the bright moon in the sky and furrowed his brows. "During the day, I once told you why I chose Dong Mountain to worship heaven," the emperor suddenly said. "The first reason was to invite Fifth Prince out of the mountain." Fan Xian looked at the emperor. The emperor gazed at him calmly and said, "The second reason is that Dong Mountain is a lonely peak by the sea. It is the best place to die." Yunrui had Yan Xiaoyi surround the mountain and then invited Uncle Luyun to come up and assassinate me. I have nowhere to go. Dong Mountain was isolated by the sea. There was only one dead end to the foot of the mountain. The side of the mountain facing the sea was a stone wall as smooth as jade. Even a great grandmaster would not be able to use lightness skills to ascend. If the emperor was assassinated there, it would truly be difficult for him to escape. I chose Dong Mountain as a place of death to give Yunrui a misconception. The emperor seemed to have shaken off the news that Sigu Jian might have come and recovered his confident expression. Calmly, he looked into Fan Xian's eyes as if he wanted to see through his heart. She thought she could seal off all news of Dong Mountain and let her do as she pleased in Jingdo. She forgot that I chose this place of death because I have a living person by my side who can fly out of this place of death. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. He thought that even his ultimate skill had not escaped the emperor's eyes. It looked like there were not many things about him that the emperor didn't know. In this world, probably only his strange method of channeling qi could help him slide down the mirror-smooth Dong Mountain. The emperor had captured him and brought him to Dong Mountain to set up an ambush there. The emperor had indeed thought far into the future. Fan Xian's heart suddenly jumped. He was no longer as worried as before. Since the emperor could even use him, how could he not have a plan to deal with the most dangerous situation in front of him? The emperor smiled slightly and said, "I once told Gong Dian that your ability to climb walls is very similar to mine. Much better than mine. Fan Xian looked at the abyss-like cliff under his feet and twisted his neck. In a rare moment, he made a joke. It's a pity that the moonlight tonight is too bright. The moon waxes and wanes. That's what you once said. The emperor raised his head to the sky and said, I cannot predict everything that will happen, but I know that the moon cannot remain this bright forever. As his words fell, a layer of dark clouds floated in from the sky and hid the full moon behind them. The silver light suddenly disappeared. Night once again descended upon the land. The summit of Dong Mountain was completely dark. There was no trace of Fan Xian at the emperor's side. The dark forest at the foot of the mountain was filled with the smell of blood. It was even more fishy than the sea breeze. Occasionally, the moonlight would brush through the forest. It was faintly possible to see corpses everywhere in the forest. Some of the corpses were lying on the ground while others were leaning weakly against tree trunks. Most of the dead wore the uniform of the Imperial Army. What was more consistent was that these Imperial Army soldiers who had been killed had numerous arrows pierced through their bodies. The arrows pierced deep into the bodies of the dead and viciously pinned them to the trees and the ground. The scene appeared wretched and terrifying. The forest at the foot of Dong Mountain was dense. The road was covered by the darkness and the forest at the same time. It was impossible to see its general appearance. One could only see countless corpses and blood. The closer they got to the foot of the mountain, the more intense the battle earlier could be seen. Fires lit and then extinguished. Only a few trees in the forest near the mountain gate were still burning. They only lit up a corner of the silent night. The smell of burning on the ground gradually rose, suppressing the smell of blood and the sea breeze. It made the soldiers on both sides nervous. Whoosh! A sharp sound broke through the air. A long arrow shot out like lightning and hit an Imperial Army soldier closest to the edge of the forest. The Imperial Army soldier gripped the long arrow in his chest and wanted to pull it out. Under the intense pain, he no longer had the strength. Slowly, he sat down. Just as he was about to sit down, 3 more arrows pierced through the air and pierced into his body. The Imperial Army soldier's head tilted to the side. Blood sprayed from his lips as he died. It was completely silent at the foot of the mountain. The 5,000 rebel soldiers had come to Dong Mountain without anyone knowing and launched the most despicable and sudden night attack on the 2,000 Imperial Army soldiers. The Imperial Army was unable to react in time. Additionally, they had followed the royal entourage to worship heaven and had not prepared the heavy armor needed for battle in the field. The attacking rebel army was Yan Xiaoyi's personal camp. More than 5,000 longbowmen and marksmen had feigned an attack between Cangzhou and Yanjing. With Sigurd-Jian's tacit approval and purposeful concealment, they had passed through the 16 vassal states of Dongyi and emerged from a secret tunnel to the north of Danzhou. Using nearly 20 days, they had sealed off Dong Mountain like 5,000 ghosts. The scouts along Dong Mountain had all been killed by the aces of the rebel army. They didn't have time to send out any news. 2,000 Imperial Army soldiers without heavy armor had been ambushed by 5,000 longbowmen. One could imagine the heavy price they had to pay. What made these Imperial Army soldiers most angry and pained was that the first wave of attack from the rebel army archers was actually fire arrows. In that instant it was as if thousands of sky lanterns had been lit at the foot of Dong Mountain. They floated toward the Imperial Army camp. The moment the fire arrows landed on the ground, they ignited. The camp began to burn. The forest began to burn. Everything began to burn. The power was ferocious. It was the spots of fire that the Qing Emperor and his group on the summit of the mountain saw. It was impossible for the Imperial Army to divert their attention to put out the fire. The burning fire and the suddenly bright night forest exposed all of their figures to the opposing archers. Although the Imperial Army was well trained and immediately found a suitable cover in the first instant, they still lost more than 200 lives in the rain of arrows that followed closely behind. What followed was a bloody and tedious counterattack, a surprise attack, failure, and annihilation. The ground was littered with bodies and the mountain was covered in fresh blood. In just a few rounds, the rebel army had defeated the Imperial army and obtained an initial victory. They had sealed off the Imperial army troops in an area half a li to the left of the mountain gate. The rebel army's attack suddenly stopped. There was only the occasional cold arrow that shot out and coldly killed the Imperial army soldiers who had tried to break out of the encirclement to report. The occasional sound of an arrow made the suddenly deathly silent forest at the foot of the mountain even quieter. It was a deathly silence. Suddenly, a person covered in blood abruptly stood up from the pile of corpses. For such a scene to suddenly appear on such a moonlit night and in such a hellish field, the soldiers on both sides felt terror. However, they immediately grew numb. So many people had died. Who would be afraid of a corpse turning? The fingers of the archers Yan Xiaoyi had sent out trembled. 10 arrows shot out. The target of each arrow was not the same. They were aimed at a certain spot on the bloody man's body and enveloped his entire body. It was very mournful, making it impossible for the person to dodge. This was a military order. No one was allowed to break out of the encirclement. Thus, each time the attacking rebel army shot a person, they had to ensure that person died. Suddenly, someone walked out from the pile of corpses. The archers unconsciously released their arrows, thinking, "Are you still not dead?" However, no one expected that the bloody man did not care about the 10 soul-devouring arrows in front of him at all. He just casually picked up 2 corpses beside him and used them as shields. Pu, 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 pu. A series of muffled sounds rang out. More than 10 arrows shot at the bloody man at almost the same time. However, in the next moment, it was clear that they had only shot at the bloody man's dancing corpse. Countless amounts of blood sprayed out, dyeing the bloody man even more horrifying. The corpse was heavier than the shield, yet this bloody man was able to dance the corpse and block the extremely fast arrows. It had to be said that this person's arm strength was very shocking. His vision and realm were even more stunning. Someone in the rebel army camp seemed to have given the order, so there were no arrows fired at the same time. The bloody man slowly put down the corpse in his hand. He grimaced as if he was sorrowful, sympathetic, and emotional about something. Then, he slowly walked in the direction of the mountain gate. Without the disturbance of the arrows, he walked very calmly. He walked to the foot of the mountain gate. A thunderous cheer came from the Imperial army. They didn't know who this bloody man was, but they knew he was an official of the Overwatch Council and a trusted aide of Commissioner Fan. Furthermore, he was an absolute ace. In the rebel army's third wave of attacks, this Overwatch Council official killed 40 longbowmen alone until he was finally knocked down by the wave of people and buried in the pile of corpses. Everyone thought he was dead. Unexpectedly, he was still alive. On such a terrifying night, at a moment and the rebel army could shoot all of the Imperial army to death at any moment, the sudden discovery of such a powerful figure on their side was enough to raise the morale of what was left of the Imperial army. That was why there was that thunderous cheer. 13th Wang walked to the foot of the scorched mountain gate and slowly sat down on the stone steps. Accepting a towel from a member of the Chinian unit beside him, he wiped the blood from his face, revealing his bright and handsome face. He grinned, revealing a mouthful of healthy white teeth. Gazing into the darkness at where the rebel army was, he smiled. 13th Wang was a true warrior. Tonight, he had learned to use a corpse to block arrows. He could no longer be considered a brute. If Fan Xian had seen this scene, he would certainly have sighed with regret. The sound of horse hooves could be heard. The rebel army parted, and a few horses came out. On the first horse sat a person. This person was shrouded in black from head to toe, and even his face was covered. Yan Xiaoyi's trusted soldiers didn't know who this black-clothed man was. They only knew that Governor Yan had given strict orders that this battle was to be commanded by this person. Although the trusted soldiers strictly obeyed military orders, they were still dissatisfied in their hearts. It wasn't until they passed through the mountains and crossed the water to the foot of Dong Mountain that this black-clothed man gave out military orders to divide and surround the imperial army and beat them into a sorry state. They were all simple orders and direct arrangements. However, they exquisitely matched the terrain at the foot of Dong Mountain and the dark night environment. This black-clothed man's use of troops was truly godly. Reality proved everything. The gazes of the 5,000 longbowmen present as they looked at the black-clothed man were filled with respect and fear. Even the puzzling military order to withdraw earlier, no one dared to question it. The black-clothed man was tall. Sitting on the horse, he appeared even more mighty. It was a pity that he was shrouded in black clothing. No one could see his true face or the might hidden under the black clothing. The black-clothed man looked at the blood-covered young man with jade-white teeth at the foot of the mountain gate. A voice came out from the black cloth and sighed with emotion. "How brave! I've tried to kill him 3 times and still haven't killed him. He truly is a warrior. If this person joins the army, in less than a year, the world will have another brave general." The black-clothed man suddenly smiled slightly. However, the general trend has already been formed. How can the strength of one man go against the heavens? It is a pity that in a bit more time, this warrior will die. Suddenly, someone beside him sighed. The black-clothed man turned his head and looked over. Warmly, he asked, "Does Master Yun value talent?" The person who sighed was none other than the first disciple of Dongyi's Sigujian, a master swordsman of his generation, Yun Zhilan. Fan Xian had indeed guessed correctly. Dongyi had indeed sent out their most elite group of assassins to help the eldest princess rebel army. Furthermore, it was Yun Zhilan who was personally leading the group. Yun Zhilan glanced at the black-clothed man beside him and forced a smile. However, he did not reply to this question. Because among all the people present, only he knew who the young man who was covered in blood and yet still maintained a smile was. That person was not an official of the Overwatch Council. He was not even a citizen of the Qing Kingdom. He was 13th Wang, his teacher's most beloved disciple and his most accomplished younger brother disciple. Have they all gone crazy? Yun Zhilan muttered to himself. He thought to himself, since my brother disciple knows that the sect has sent people, why is he still standing guard at the mountain gate like a fierce tiger? What exactly is he thinking? Teacher sent you to follow Fan Xian, but he didn't want you to truly become Fan Xian's helper. Yun Zhilan looked at the bloody man at the foot of the mountain gate in the distance and thought with great confusion. To be loyal to one thing after doing something? To even disregard the interests of the sect? Is this madness, or is it the open killing nature that teacher admires the most? If one does not go crazy, how can one survive? The black-clothed man lightly replied to Yun Zhilan's sigh. Yun Zhilan shook his head and didn't say anything. Although he didn't know why his younger brother disciple would do this, as the heir of the sword hut, he respected his younger brother disciple. Thus, he would not reveal his younger brother disciple's background in front of this black-clothed man. He didn't know who this black-clothed man was, but all of the troops were led by him. Furthermore, after watching from the side for a long time, he had to admit that this black-clothed man's use of troops was indeed remarkable. He did not take any risks or clever tricks. He fought steadily step by step and managed to deploy the resources of the entire rebel army to a near-perfect realm. He did not give the Qing Imperial Army any chance to counterattack or break out of the encirclement. Yun Zhilan brought out most of the aces of the sword hut to cooperate with Yan Xiaoyi's trusted soldiers. The cooperation between the two sides had always been problematic. If the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council on the mountain or the highly skilled Tiger Guards had broken out, it would not have been so easy to completely seal them off. However, the black-clothed man on the horse seemed to have a pair of godly eyes that could see all the details on the battlefield. At the beginning of the surprise attack, he forcefully ordered the aces of Dongyi to go to seemingly unassuming places to set up ambushes. At the beginning, Yunjilan didn't understand. As the repeated attacks happened in the darkness and the repeated attempts to break out of the encirclement on Dong Mountain were ruthlessly pressed down by the black-clothed man's wrist, Yunjilan finally understood. This black-clothed man was no ordinary person. He was able to command the entire battlefield and not let go of any possible openings. Such a use of troops could not be achieved without decades of experience on the battlefield. Thus, Yunjilan was confused as to why Yan Xiaoyi had not personally led the troops here. Who exactly was this black-clothed man? He was guessing. Many people in the rebel army were guessing the black-clothed man's identity. This black-clothed man had only brought 2 trusted soldiers into the rebel army. He was free and at ease, but he used troops like he was moving his fingers. He was free and decisive in killing. He was worthy of admiration. The black-clothed man did not explain to his subordinates why he had stopped attacking. He only looked coldly at the suddenly rising mountain in front of him. Leading the rebel army to attack this time was only a part of the agreement. If he didn't temporarily hold this power in his own hands, it would be difficult for the emperor to make that decision. Suddenly, a black cloud floated across the sky and completely covered the bright moon. The area near the mountain gate was covered in darkness. The black-clothed man sat motionless on the horse. Only the short weapons in the cloth bags held by his 2 trusted subordinates beside him flickered with a faint light. Fan Xian didn't know how long this cloud would cover the moon. He silently slid down the mountain. He didn't slow or speed up. Terrifyingly, he maintained a steady speed. During the day, the jade-like wall facing the sea of Dong Mountain gave off a faint and deep light in the night. It merged perfectly with him, who was wearing black clothing. The knife-like dividing line along the 2 sides of Dong Mountain pierced straight into the ground by the sea. There were aces from Dongyi lying in ambush there, so he could not choose that route. He could only descend from the side facing the sea breeze. No one in this world could slide down from such a hopeless situation, other than Fan Xian. Thus, he was not worried that the people on the sea or the rebel soldiers on land would discover his tracks. He was still incomparably nervous because he always felt a pair of eyes behind him piercing through the night and the whistling sea breeze and calmly watching him. You're tuning into the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.